only for those who fear the wheel. If your heart still believes there is something sweet left to win in this world, then what I'm about to say may feel too severe, too cold, even impossible to accept. This is not a message for the excited, the curious, or the spiritually entertained. It is for the tired ones, the ones who still go to work, still smile, still answer messages, still sit at family tables, still carry responsibilities. But somewhere underneath all of that, they have begun to tremble. They have begun to notice that every pleasure fades, every gain slips, every relationship changes, every body weakens, and every life, no matter how decorated, bends toward aging, loss, and death. If you find this useful, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment. Because what we are opening here is not a theory, not a philosophy for decoration, but a dangerous kind of honesty. The kind that begins only when a person is no longer willing to keep bargaining with samsara. Let me say this clearly from the beginning. This is not a rejection of people. It is not saying anyone is inferior, impure, or unwelcome. It is saying something harder than that. It is saying that the Dharma of liberation cannot be digested by a mind that is still in love with the taste of the world. A person may admire the Buddha, may quote teachings, may enjoy the atmosphere of meditation, may even call themselves a seeker, but if deep inside, they still believe that one more success, one more romance, one more achievement, one more beautiful season, one more solved problem will finally make existence worth clinging to, then the deepest layer of the Buddha's message will sound offensive. Why? Because the Buddha does not flatter our attachments. He does not come to improve our chains. He comes to point at the chains and say, leave. And most people are not ready to hear that. As long as there is still hope that this world can satisfy, we do not want liberation. We want renovation. We want a smoother schedule, a kinder partner, a healthier body, more money, fewer enemies, better luck, more recognition, better sleep, and a little spiritual comfort to help us enjoy it all without guilt. We want the house rearranged. We do not want to leave the burning house. That is why teachings on true release are not merely difficult, they are unwelcome. They threaten the very dream most people are still trying to protect. So when it is said that this path is only for those who fear birth and death, only for those who are weary of samsara, it must not be heard as poetry. It is practical. It is exact. If there is no deep exhaustion with the cycle itself, then the heart will always secretly resist the medicine. This is the first shock. The Buddha's liberating Dharma is not for everyone. Not because truth is stingy, but because readiness is rare. A person can study profound teachings and still not be ready. A person can memorize doctrines and still not be ready. A person can speak beautifully about mindfulness, compassion, emptiness, and karma, and still not be ready. Readiness begins when something breaks in the old confidence. When a person no longer says, I just need to fix a few things and then I'll be okay. Readiness begins when one starts to suspect, with painful clarity, that even the brightest moments in life cannot protect anyone from collapse. That every embrace ends in separation, every possession ends in loss, every identity ends in dissolution, and every birth already contains the sentence of death. From that point of view, the teaching is not introduced as comfort. It is introduced as a door, but it is a door that only opens for those who are ready to stop negotiating with suffering. And there are 3 reasons for that. The first is simple and brutal. If you are not disgusted with samsara, you cannot accept the Buddha's direction, because the Buddha points outward from the whole arrangement. He does not teach us how to become more elegantly trapped. He teaches renunciation. He teaches dispassion. He teaches the cooling of fever. He teaches the ending of thirst. To the worldly mind, this sounds like loss. To the intoxicated heart, it sounds like death before death. If I still believe there is nectar hidden somewhere in this spinning wheel, why would I want to step off? Why would I listen to anyone who tells me The ride itself is the problem. That is why people hear the Dharma and shrink back. Not because it is unclear, but because it asks for a kind of honesty that attachment cannot tolerate. If I still think there is something here, worth securing forever, then the Buddha's invitation feels like theft. It feels like he is taking away my dreams, but he is not taking away reality. He is exposing fantasy. The second reason is this. If you are not weary of birth and death, then you are still deluded about them. You are still under the spell. You are still calling unstable things stable, painful things pleasant, ownerless processes, me and mine. You are still looking at flames and talking about warmth while ignoring the burning. And if one is still enchanted by delusion, why would one sincerely enter a path whose purpose is to undo enchantment? Why would someone deeply attached to becoming choose a teaching aimed at the ending of becoming? Why would someone fascinated with identity willingly approach a path that cuts through identity at the root? This is why spiritual curiosity is not enough. Curiosity can visit the path. It cannot walk it very far. A mind still drunk on the world may collect teachings, compare traditions, discuss subtle ideas, and enjoy the feeling of depth. But when the Dharma begins to threaten attachment, that same mind will retreat. It will reinterpret. It will soften. It will beautify the message until it becomes bearable. It will turn liberation into self-improvement, because self-improvement is still acceptable to the ego. True relinquishment is not. The third reason is perhaps the most obvious, though many do not dare say it. The ideal of the Dharma runs against the ordinary instincts of worldly life. The world says acquire. The Dharma says let go. The world says become someone. The Dharma says investigate the one who wants to become. The world says seek pleasure, avoid discomfort, secure your image, defend your territory, prolong your story. The Dharma says all of this binds you. The world says keep feeding the fire carefully. The Dharma says understand fire so thoroughly that craving ends. If my whole emotional structure is built around gain, praise, status, romance, possession, continuity, and becoming, then why would I rush into a training that undermines all of that? Why would I put my head into a path that goes directly against the things I still cherish? That would feel unnatural, maybe even frightening. So again, the problem is not that the teaching is unfair. The problem is that the unwearied heart does not want what the teaching offers. And this matters, because many people approach the Dharma as if it were a beautiful addition to life, when in truth the Dharma of liberation is a revolution against the assumptions of life as we ordinarily live it. This path is not against joy. It is against intoxication. It is not against human tenderness. It is against bondage. It is not against living beings. It is against delusion, craving, and the endless machinery of suffering. But if a person still longs deeply for heavenly pleasures, worldly blessings, emotional sweetness, refined experiences, beautiful identities, and pleasing rebirths, then they are not yet aiming at final release. They may be religious, they may be moral, they may be sincere in many ways, but they are not yet desperate for freedom from the wheel itself. And this is where the teaching becomes difficult to hear, because from the standpoint of liberation, even a refined existence is still bound up with unsatisfactoriness. Even the highest pleasant states are unstable. Even a noble life, if conditioned, is not beyond danger. As long as there is arising, there is passing. As long as there is birth, there is death. As long as there is presence in the field of conditions, there is vulnerability. The world may offer polished forms of experience, but it cannot offer safety. To someone still enchanted, this sounds excessive. To someone beginning to wake up, it sounds painfully true. Maybe that is you. Maybe from the outside your life is ordinary, even successful. Maybe you have known love, laughter, beauty, skill, friendship, comfort, or recognition. Maybe there were days when the sunlight felt enough, when a meal tasted good, when music reached somewhere tender in you. when another person's hand made the world seem briefly survivable, and yet, even then, something in you knew it would not hold. Something in you knew that every lovely moment was already trembling on the edge of disappearance. You did not need to become pessimistic to see this. You only had to become honest. The quiet suffering that drives a person toward the Dharma is often hidden. It does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is not public grief or visible failure. Sometimes it is the private exhaustion of repeating oneself, waking, striving, worrying, desiring, protecting, losing, recovering, desiring again. Sometimes it is the shock of discovering that what you worked so hard to obtain did not free you from fear. Sometimes it is the unbearable recognition that even your happiest chapter could not bargain your body out of aging or your loved ones out of death. Sometimes it is not one tragedy, but the slow education of impermanence wearing down illusion little by little. When that insight ripens, the heart becomes teachable in a new way. Not because it has become depressed, but because it has stopped being easily seduced. This is the audience for what follows. Not people who hate life in a dramatic, careless sense, but people who have begun to see through it. People who understand that samsara is not condemned because someone is angry at it, but because it cannot keep its promises. It cannot provide lasting refuge. It cannot produce stable satisfaction out of unstable conditions. It cannot turn what is breakable into what is safe. And once you begin to see that, a strange tenderness appears. You stop demanding that the world save you. You stop asking passing things to act eternal. You stop worshipping moments simply because they feel warm. You begin, however faintly, to respect the Buddha's severity. Not as cruelty, but as mercy, because a surgeon who smiles and lies to the patient is not compassionate. A guide who tells you the cliff is a garden is not kind. A teacher who knows the house is burning and still encourages you to decorate the walls is not a liberator. The Buddha speaks the way one speaks when something is truly at stake. So if this teaching already feels too sharp, that itself reveals something important. If part of you is recoiling, offended, bargaining, insisting that surely there must still be enough sweetness in this life to make clinging reasonable, then listen carefully to that reaction. Do not suppress it. Learn from it. It may be showing you exactly where attachment still hides. And if another part of you feels strangely relieved, as if at last someone is refusing to lie to you, then stay. That relief may be the beginning of readiness, because readiness matters more than curiosity, more than admiration, more than spiritual fashion, more than borrowed language and second-hand wisdom. Without readiness, the liberating message of the Buddha becomes unbearable. With readiness, even hard truth begins to sound like compassion. And once that is understood, we can look more closely at why the Buddha's message becomes so difficult, so unacceptable, to a heart that is not yet weary of birth and death. This difficulty is not accidental. It is built into the very nature of the Buddha's teaching. The problem is not that the teaching is unclear, or too abstract, or too severe for no reason. The problem is that it points in a direction most hearts do not truly want to go. We may say we want truth. We may say we want peace. We may even say we want liberation. But very often, if we are honest, what we really want is a more comfortable arrangement inside the life we already cling to. We want less anxiety, but not the ending of craving. We want less pain, but not the ending of possessiveness. We want calm, but with our preferences intact. We want healing, but we do not want to be separated from the very attachments that keep the wound alive. That is why the Buddha's message can sound gentle on the surface, and yet, at a deeper level, feel almost unbearable, because he does not come to help us decorate. Prison he comes to show us the door, and that is frightening. It is frightening to the part of us that still believes there is something here, worth securing, worth perfecting, worth becoming. As long as the mind still dreams of a better version of samsara, It will resist anyone who speaks of leaving samsara behind. It may still listen politely. It may even admire the teaching, but inwardly it recoils, because it hears, beneath every teaching on impermanence, suffering, and non-self, a threat to its private project of becoming. This is why the first great obstacle is so simple and so deep at the same time. If one is not tired of birth and death, one cannot really accept the Buddha, not fully, not the marrow. One may accept parts of him. One may accept ethics, meditation, kindness, mindfulness, compassion, generosity, concentration, maybe even wisdom in a poetic sense. But the central movement of the Dhamma, the movement away from intoxication with existence itself, that remains too much. Because the Buddha does not flatter our favorite illusions. He does not tell us that fulfillment lies in becoming more impressive, more admired, more spiritually refined, or more cosmically rewarded. He does not say, stay where you are, but make it prettier. He does not say, keep the fire burning, but learn to enjoy the warmth without the smoke. He says something far more radical. He says this whole burning process is unreliable. This entire structure of craving, becoming, loss, grief, fear, hope, grasping and rebirth is not a home, and if you hear that while still secretly in love with the house, you will not call it compassion, you will call it excessive, harsh, pessimistic, too much. But imagine a house on fire. Some people inside are already choking, their eyes burn, their lungs hurt, they know they cannot stay. To them the voice shouting, "Get out now," is mercy. It may sound urgent, but it is merciful. Yet another person inside the same house may still be admiring the curtains. They may be adjusting a picture frame. They may be saying, "Yes, I know there is smoke, but this room has beautiful light in the morning." That person will not welcome the same message. They will say, "Why are you so negative? Why can't we save the furniture? Why not improve ventilation? Why not repaint the walls?" This is how the unwearied mind hears the Buddha. It hears renunciation as loss rather than relief. It hears dispassion as coldness rather than freedom. It hears the ending of becoming as annihilation rather than peace. It hears restraint as deprivation, simplicity as failure, seclusion as loneliness, and non-clinging as a threat to identity. Why? Because it still assumes that all meaning must come from possession, experience, recognition, continuity, and self-construction. So when the Buddha points beyond worldly intoxication, the heart that still longs for intoxication naturally resists. That intoxication can be crude, or it can be very refined. Sometimes it is obvious: money, romance, influence, beauty, praise, comfort, youth, status, but sometimes it wears noble clothing. The mind says, "I do not want gross pleasure, I only want meaningful work, a good reputation, moral beauty, a wise image, a heavenly rebirth, a luminous meditative identity." Yet even here, becoming is still becoming. Craving has not disappeared. Just because it learned elegant manners, this is why the Dhamma unsettles even serious practitioners. It keeps cutting deeper than expected. A person may come thinking, "I want to suffer less," and the Buddha patiently begins there. But eventually the teaching reveals something uncomfortable. Suffering does not end merely because pain is reduced. It ends when craving is understood and abandoned. And craving is not only the craving for what is ugly and obvious. It is also the craving for what is beautiful, elevated, meaningful, sacred, and admired. The mind that is not yet weary of birth and death hears this and begins negotiating. It says, "Can I practice deeply, but still keep a strong sense of who I am? Can I meditate, but still preserve my ambition? Can I be spiritual, but remain attractive in the eyes of others? Can I learn detachment, but only from the things I was going to lose anyway? Can I do good deeds so that my future will be safer, brighter, more rewarding? Can I use this path to become a better me?" And that last one is especially subtle. Many people approach the path as a project of self-improvement. On one level, that is understandable. A scattered mind becomes steadier. An angry heart becomes gentler. A reckless life becomes more disciplined. These are wholesome developments. But if we are not careful, we turn the Dhamma into a mirror for polishing the self-image. We begin using profound teachings to produce a more admirable person, rather than freedom from clinging to personhood itself. Then practice becomes another identity. One is no longer intoxicated by wealth or beauty perhaps, but by being the one who understands, the one who meditates, the one who lives simply, the one who speaks of emptiness, the one who has insight, the one who is different from ordinary people. The costume changes, but the clinging remains. The house is still burning. Only now the furniture looks more spiritual. The same thing happens with religion as emotional comfort. There is nothing wrong with being comforted by truth. The problem comes when comfort becomes the hidden goal. Then one only accepts the parts of the teaching that soothe, console, and reassure. One welcomes kindness, ritual, community, sacred language, blessings, hope, maybe even serene states of meditation. But one quietly avoids whatever threatens attachment. One does not want to hear too much about the danger of sensuality, the exhaustion of becoming, the burden of identity, the rarity of fortunate rebirth, the nearness of death, the unattractiveness of the body, or the radical demand of letting go. So one develops selective hearing. One says yes, compassion, yes, mindfulness, yes, inner peace, yes, gratitude, yes, loving presence. But when the teaching says, see the danger in what you love, see the instability of all formations, see that even refined existence is still bound up with unsatisfactoriness, see that anything conditioned cannot be your refuge, the heart stiffens. It becomes defensive. It says, surely that is too extreme. Surely there must be a balanced way. Surely the Buddha did not mean we must let go that much. But very often that reaction does not come from wisdom. It comes from attachment trying to survive. The Buddha's path is balanced, yes, but not in the way craving wants balance. Craving wants a compromise. It wants permission to remain enchanted, while borrowing enough Dharma to feel noble. It wants enough truth to reduce panic, but not enough truth to overturn the whole structure of delusion. It wants merit, but often as investment. It wants virtue, but often for self-respect. It wants meditation, but often for relief. It wants teachings, but often for language. It wants religion, but often for emotional shelter. And be misunderstood ways. Good actions are beautiful. Generosity, virtue, reverence, restraint, service, patience, these matter deeply. They brighten the mind. They support wisdom. They create favorable conditions. But if merit is pursued only as a way to secure a better future within the cycle, then one is still bargaining with samsara. One is still saying, I do not want release yet. I just want a better room in the same burning house. A more pleasant rebirth, a finer identity, a more fortunate existence, a more celestial experience. These may sound lofty compared to ordinary ambition, but the underlying movement can remain the same. The hand is still reaching, the heart is still building, the mind is still leaning toward continuation. And because of that, the sharp edge of the Buddha's message remains difficult to bear. He is not merely offering improved conditions. He is revealing the peril of all conditioned existence when clung to. He is not against happiness. He is not against goodness. He is not against peace. But he sees more clearly than we do that, as long as the mind remains bound by ignorance and thirst, even what is bright and pleasant becomes unstable ground. So he teaches not only how to live more skillfully, but how to stop mistaking the unstable for the safe. That is why those who still cherish the dream of becoming will often reshape the teaching into something more digestible. They soften it into inspiration. They shrink it into therapy. They turn it into culture, symbolism, aesthetics, moralism, or personal growth. They keep the fragrance and remove the fire. They keep the language of awakening while quietly protecting the causes of sleep. And this is not something only other people do. This is something each of us must watch in ourselves. Where do I listen eagerly? And where do I flinch? Which teachings feel beautiful to me, and which ones I instinctively push away? Do I want liberation, or do I want a sanctified version of my attachments? Do I seek truth even when it corners me, or only when it comforts me? When I say I want peace, do I mean the peace of non-clinging, or merely the peace of having my conditions arranged to my liking? These are painful questions, but they are compassionate questions, because they expose the distance between what we say and what we actually serve. The Buddha asks us to go out, that is the point. Not to repaint the walls of samsara in calmer colors, not to install better lighting in a place that still burns, not to write poetry about the flames while refusing the exit. He points to renunciation not because he hates life, but because he understands bondage. He points to dispassion not because beauty is evil, but because whatever is grasped becomes a basis for fear. He points to cessation not because existence is meaningless, but because what is conditioned cannot satisfy a heart that longs for the unshakable. If that sounds severe, it is only because craving hears freedom as insult. To the weary heart, it sounds different. To the heart that has suffered enough, that has seen enough repetition, enough loss, enough false promises, enough rebuilding and breaking, the Buddha's words do not sound cruel. They sound clean, they sound honest, they sound like someone who finally refuses to deceive us. So if rejection of this path arises so naturally, if resistance appears not only in worldliness, but even in spiritual life, then we have to look beneath the resistance itself. We have to ask what kind of mind clings this tightly, defends this desperately, and keeps turning back toward the very things that wound it. And once we ask that sincerely, we are led to the deeper issue. What is the state of mind that cannot stop reaching, cannot stop leaning, cannot stop mistaking danger for refuge? That state of mind is not wisdom, it is not courage, it is not healthy optimism. If a person still does not fear samsara, that does not mean they are strong. It means they still do not see. It means the fire is burning, but they are calling it warmth. It means the trap is closed around the ankle, but they are decorating the chain. It means conditioned existence is still being misread as opportunity, as beauty, as romance, as personal destiny, when in truth it is unstable from top to bottom. This is what must be said very plainly, because people often flatter themselves at exactly this point. They think, I am not afraid of life because I am mature, I am not troubled by becoming, because I am positive. I still want things because I am passionate, alive, engaged. But the Buddha does not praise intoxication just because it looks energetic. He does not call delusion beautiful just because it is popular. A mind that is not yet disenchanted with samsara is still under a spell. That is the simple truth. And delusion does not always look dark, ugly, or dramatic. Most of the time it looks ordinary. That is why it is so dangerous. Delusion is not only the criminal, the tyrant, the addict collapsed in public ruin. Delusion is also the respectable person with plans, the romantic person with hopes, the ambitious person with goals, the anxious person trying to secure one more layer of safety, the spiritual person secretly wanting to be admired for being spiritual. Delusion can wear silk, it can wear a business suit, it can carry prayer beads, it can speak softly, it can look educated, refined, and disciplined. But if the heart is still leaning outward, still begging the world to complete it, then the intoxication remains. That intoxication is subtle because it feels so natural from the inside. The mind runs toward pleasure and says, this is normal. It runs toward recognition and says, I only want to be appreciated. It runs toward romance and says, I only want love. It runs toward status and says, I only want to make something of myself. It runs toward security and says, I am only being responsible. It runs even toward spiritual identity and says, I only want to be good, pure, advanced, respected. In every direction, craving changes its clothes and asks not to be questioned. But what is happening underneath all of this? The same old movement. reaching, grasping, projecting, becoming. The mind imagines fulfillment in the next arrangement of conditions. It says, not yet, but soon. Not here, but there. Not this version of me, but the improved one. Not this relationship, but the right one. Not this job, but the better one. Not this body, but the stronger one. Not this recognition, but a little more. And because the promise is always located just ahead, the mind keeps running. It calls that movement life. It calls that movement meaning. It calls that movement hope. This is delusion in its everyday form. It does not announce itself as delusion. It appears as momentum. It appears as personality. It appears as personal preference. It appears as taste, ambition, chemistry, timing, vision, drive. And because everybody around us is speaking the same language, the madness receives social confidence. Is chasing, so chasing feels sane. Everyone is restless, so restlessness feels vibrant. Everyone is frightened of emptiness, so constant stimulation feels like health. Everyone is repeating the same hunger in different costumes, so repetition feels like a rich human story instead of a wheel turning in circles. Look carefully and you will see how deep the enchantment goes. The same disappointments come again and again, but the mind keeps repainting them. Desire arises, pursuit begins. Contact happens, pleasure flashes. Fear enters, change begins, dissatisfaction returns. Then grief, boredom, irritation, numbness, longing. Then another object, another dream, another attachment. It is the same architecture repeated in countless forms. Yet the deluded mind does not say, I have seen this mechanism enough. It says, maybe next time it will finally become what I wanted. That maybe is one of the strongest chains in samsara. This is why not. Fearing samsara is not innocence. It is intoxication. A drunk person may smile, sing, and speak boldly, but that does not mean they perceive clearly. In the same way, the worldling may talk about dreams, love, success, self-expression, legacy, and even inner growth. But if they have not understood the instability and danger built into all conditioned existence, then they are still spiritually drunk. They may be functioning, they may be charming, they may be praised by others, but deep down, they are moving through a burning house while admiring the wallpaper. The tragedy is that delusion is pleasant in the beginning. That is why so many protect it. To be intoxicated by life can feel poetic. Craving can feel intimate. Restlessness can feel like possibility. Emotional turbulence can feel like depth. Wanting can feel like proof that one is alive. The mind says, if I stop longing, what will remain? If I stop chasing, will life become empty? If I stop building an identity, who will I be? So it clings not only to objects but to the drama of pursuit itself. It is not only attached to pleasure, it is attached to becoming someone on the way to pleasure. And so what is actually exhausting gets interpreted as meaningful. What is actually repetitive gets interpreted as fresh. What is actually dangerous gets interpreted as worth the risk. This is how delusion survives. It edits reality. It highlights the sweet beginning and conceals the bitter continuation. It romanticizes attachment and whispers over the anxiety hidden inside it. It celebrates achievement and refuses to count the fear of losing it. It glorifies youth while ignoring its passing. It worships beauty while denying its fragility. It seeks companionship while overlooking separation. It chases praise while pretending not to hear the terror of blame. When the Buddha points to all of this, many people think he is being too harsh, but maybe he is simply the only one in the room who is not drunk. Think personally for a moment. If your heart still sincerely believes that pleasure will save you, that admiration will complete you, that the right relationship will settle you, that success will justify you, that comfort will protect you, that visibility will confirm you, then how can the path of renunciation feel anything but threatening? Of course it will feel unnatural. Of course letting go will seem severe. Of course dispassion will sound cold. Because from within delusion, The chain does not look like a chain. It looks like treasure. The cage does not look like imprisonment. It looks like identity. And this is the central question that must be asked without sentimentality. If you still love the chains, why force your head into a path whose essence is letting go? Why come to a teaching of relinquishment while inwardly bargaining to keep your intoxications? Why approach a path of disenchantment while still secretly praying that the world can satisfy you? Why stand at the gate of liberation while clutching the very things that bind you to the wheel? This is not a moral accusation. It is a question of honesty. Because if the heart is still devoted to becoming, acquiring, displaying, securing, seducing, winning, and being somebody in the eyes of the world, then it is simply not yet aligned with what the Dharma is for. The Dharma is not an ornament for a life of craving. It is not there to make samsara more elegant. It is not a philosophy for emotional decoration. It is not meditation as lifestyle enhancement. It is not sacred language for worldly ambition. Its current flows in another direction. It cools where the world inflames. It loosens where the world tightens. It empties where the world accumulates. It teaches seeing through, not dressing up. It teaches release, not refinement of bondage. So if someone is still intoxicated with romance, intoxicated with status, intoxicated with self-improvement as ego construction, intoxicated with pleasure, intoxicated with the hope of being exceptional, then that person will almost inevitably distort the Dharma. They will try to recruit it into service of self. They will use spiritual practice to feel superior, to feel special, to feel safe, to gain a new identity, to polish the prison bars until they shine. Even their sincerity will be mixed. Even their devotion will be unstable, because the root direction of the heart is still outward, still toward becoming, still toward fabrication. And this is why the Buddha's way is only truly intelligible to the one who has begun to feel weary in a very deep way, not depressed in the ordinary sense, not dramatic, not hateful toward life, but sober. Sober enough to notice that what keeps being offered to us again and again is variation, not deliverance. New faces, old hunger, new roles, old fear, new possessions, old insecurity, new achievements, old emptiness, new praise, old vulnerability, new beginnings, old endings. If this has not yet entered the blood as a felt understanding, then renunciation will sound excessive. But once that delusion begins to crack, something changes. You start to see how much of what is called normal life is simply rehearsed enchantment. You see how craving has been marketed as identity. You see how instability has been normalized. You see how people call it living when they are mostly oscillating between excitement and anxiety. You see how they call it success when it only means a better furnished form of uncertainty. You see how they call it love even when fear, possession, loneliness, dependency, and grief are woven through it from the start. Not because love is evil, but because whatever is conditioned cannot escape change, and whatever cannot escape change cannot finally serve as refuge. Then the issue becomes painfully simple. If you still want what the world is selling, why pretend to want release from the market? If you still believe samsara has something essential left to give you, why be shocked when the Dharma asks you to loosen your grip? If the heart still says, "Let me stay, let me taste a little more, let me try one more version, let me become one more self," then the path of ending will feel like loss, not freedom. That is why not fearing samsara means one is still deluded. One has not yet understood the terms of the contract. One is still negotiating with impermanence, as though it can be persuaded. One is still sleeping next to danger and calling it companionship. One is still mistaking repetition for promise. And until that is seen, deeply seen, the ideals of the Dharma will not merely seem difficult. They will seem almost opposite to everything the ordinary heart has been trained to desire. And once that is recognized, another truth begins to sting with great clarity. The vision of the Dharma and the ambitions of ordinary life do not comfortably fit together. They lean in different directions. They are built on different assumptions. One aims at cessation, the other multiplies entanglement. One teaches relinquishment, the other rewards acquisition. One points toward peace beyond becoming, the other keeps baptizing becoming as the highest good. That mismatch must be faced honestly, because only then can we understand why the path feels so foreign to the mind that is still in love with the world. That is why the path can feel less like comfort and more like an insult, not because it is cruel, but because it dares to question the very things most people have organized their whole lives around. The world tells us, from the time we are small, to gather, to improve, to secure, to shine, to be recognized, to become somebody. It tells us to build a name, protect an image, enlarge our options, decorate our identity, and keep searching for the arrangement of conditions that will finally make life feel complete. And then the Dharma appears and says, look again. Look more deeply, count the cost. See the fever hidden inside the chase. See how desire never simply asks for one thing and rests. It asks, and then asks again. It obtains, and then trembles at loss. It celebrates, and then fears decline. It loves, and then clings. It gains, and then starts guarding that as a hard message for a mind still enchanted by the world. Because the worldly mind does not merely enjoy things, it builds itself out of them. It says, this beauty is me, this success is me, this love is me, this reputation is me, this body is me, this future. I am story I'm telling, this place I want to reach, this is who I am. So when the Dharma speaks about letting go, cooling passion, loosening identity, ending compulsive becoming, the unprepared heart hears not wisdom but threat. It feels as if something precious is under attack. And in a way, something is under attack. Illusion is under attack. Intoxication is under attack. The habit of worshipping experience is under attack. The deep, unquestioned assumption that, if I can just arrange the world correctly, I will finally be safe. That assumption is under attack. No wonder people resist. No wonder they feel uneasy. No wonder the teachings sound too severe, too dry, too extreme. If someone still believes the banquet of worldly life has real nourishment left in it, why would they want a teaching that keeps pointing out the poison mixed into every dish? The ordinary current of life runs in one direction. It says accumulate more, taste more, travel more, own more, be desired more, be admired more, build a better body, build a stronger profile, build a more impressive life. Even sorrow gets recruited into this machinery. People turn pain into identity, struggle into branding, longing into personality. Everything becomes material for becoming someone. Even goodness is often used this way. Even spirituality is often used this way. Not to be free, but to become admirable. Not to end vanity, but to refine it. But the Dharma runs against that current. It does not teach us how to become a more elegant prisoner. It does not promise a holier version of worldly intoxication. It does not exist to make samsara more tasteful. It asks a far more unsettling question. What if the problem is not that you have too little, but that you still believe acquisition can heal what is fundamentally unhealable by acquisition? What if the problem is not that you have not yet found the right pleasure, the right partner, the right station, the right recognition, but that you are still trapped in the movement of reaching, guarding, fearing, and becoming? That is why this path seems absurd to people who are not ready for it. It sounds like asking a thirsty person to distrust water. It sounds like asking a lonely person to question attachment. It sounds like asking an ambitious person to examine ambition, not as glory but as bondage. It sounds offensive because it touches the sacred idols of ordinary life. Take beauty. If a person has youth, a little attractiveness, some charm, a body that still obeys them, a face that still opens doors, how difficult it is for that person to hear calmly that all of this is unstable, unreliable, and not worth clinging to. The mind does not want a sermon on impermanence. when the mirror is still kind. It wants to enjoy being seen. It wants to be chosen, envied, desired, remembered. It wants the sweetness of being looked at and approved of. So when the Dharma says, even this is burning, even this is bait, even this will betray you, the mind pulls back. It says, not yet. Let me have a little more time. Let me enjoy this a little longer. Take if there is financial comfort, if one can buy choice, convenience, escape, protection, if one can soften the harshness of life with possessions and options, then why would one naturally feel drawn toward renunciation? Money gives the illusion that suffering can be negotiated with. It creates the feeling that one is less vulnerable than others. And even when people know intellectually that wealth cannot stop aging, illness, separation or death, emotionally they still bow before it. They still trust it. They still think with enough resources. Maybe the blow will hurt less, maybe. I can stay above the common pain, the Dharma comes and says. Wealth cannot purchase release. Comfort cannot cancel bondage. Security inside the unstable is still unstable. Again, that does not flatter the mind, it unsettles it. Take health, as long as the body still functions, as long as sleep comes, digestion works, legs carry us. Lungs fill, memory holds, appetite returns, the urgency of liberation feels distant. A healthy person can talk about death like a concept. A sick person hears it differently. The world celebrates strength because strength creates confidence in continued becoming. I still have time. I still have force. I still have options. But the Dharma whispers, or sometimes shouts, that the body has never signed a contract with you. Its loyalty was always temporary. To build your deepest hopes on flesh, sensation, vitality, and biological luck is to build on water. Take romance. This one is especially powerful. The hunger to be loved, to be chosen, to belong to someone, and to have someone belong to us. This can drown out almost every spiritual instinct, especially when affection is fresh, when desire is answered, when the heart is intoxicated by attention, longing, fantasy, touch, and emotional promise. In such a season, who wants to hear about disenchantment? Who wants to hear about attachment as a chain? People do not come to the Dharma easily. When they are drunk on mutual longing, they say they want truth, but what they often want is blessing for their dream. They do not want release from fire. They want the fire to burn more beautifully. Take youth itself. Youth has a certain arrogance even in gentle people. It carries the intuition of extension. It imagines many tomorrows. It postpones seriousness. It says there will be time later to reflect deeply, time later to let go, time later to practice earnestly. First let me live. First let me test the world. First let me taste what is available. But that late is one of the most dangerous words in spiritual life, because later is where countless intentions go to die. Later is where wisdom is endlessly deferred in the name of one more experience. And then there is influence, reputation, status, the pleasure of being somebody in the eyes of others. This one is subtle because it can wear respectable clothes. It can appear as service, intelligence, sophistication, leadership, contribution. But the ego knows how to feed on all of it. To be listened to be quoted, to be needed, to be followed, to be regarded as insightful or good or important. These are powerful intoxications. The world calls them success. The Dharma asks whether success that deepens selfing is truly success at all. So if a person still finds these things deeply delicious, deeply meaningful, deeply worth pursuing, then the language of release will sound strange at best and hostile at worst. Because Buddhism, in its liberating aim, is not trying to help the self complete its favorite project. It is exposing the exhaustion built into the project itself. It is not saying, become nobody as an act of self-hatred. It is saying, see the suffering hidden in the need to keep manufacturing a somebody. See the burden of constant self-construction. See the fear behind the performance. See the endless maintenance required to protect a fragile identity in a changing world. And if this is not seen, If one enters the path while still secretly worshipping worldly gain, then what happens? Very often not liberation, very often performance. One begins to speak the language of renunciation, while inwardly bargaining for admiration. One talks about emptiness while being full of comparison. One praises simplicity while craving specialness. One criticizes attachment while clinging fiercely to views, roles, communities, and spiritual image. This is why entering the path without genuine disillusionment can become dangerous. The old hunger does not disappear. It changes costume, then religion becomes theater. Practice becomes decoration. Humility becomes posture. Wisdom becomes quotation. Detachment becomes superiority. The person may look devout, may sound deep, may collect teachings, may sit in meditation, may learn sacred vocabulary, but inwardly the machinery of craving is still running the show, still wanting to become, still wanting to possess, still wanting to win, still wanting to be seen as advanced, pure, awakened, different from ordinary people. And because the stated ideal and the actual desire are pulling in opposite directions, the heart becomes divided. There is strain, there is self-deception, there is guilt, there is suppression, there is hidden resentment toward the teaching itself. This is why the path can feel unbearable to someone who still loves the world in an unquestioned way. Not because the Dharma is wrong, but because it asks for an honesty that cuts deep. It asks us to admit that what we call happiness is often only interruption of discomfort, that what we call identity is often a bundle of defended habits, that what we call success is often polished anxiety, that what we call love is often possession trembling in poetic language. It asks us to stop romanticizing the very engine that keeps suffering in motion. And that is not a message for everybody at every moment. There are people who still sincerely want the world. They want better circumstances, finer pleasures, lasting affection, visible success, honorable standing, and favorable rebirth. They may still be kind people. They may still be moral, thoughtful, generous, even religious, but the fire of renunciation has not yet really begun in them. Their hearts are still negotiating with samsara. They do not yet want out. They only want a kinder arrangement inside. The Dharma of liberation cannot be honestly received there. It will be edited, softened, repackaged, made inspirational, made affirming, made compatible with ambition, desire, and self-enhancement. But once the teaching is bent that way, its cutting edge is gone. It no longer points beyond the world. It simply helps the world feel more meaningful. So we have to be truthful. If the teaching really moves against the grain of ordinary life, if it challenges beauty, wealth, health, romance, youth, influence, reputation, identity, and every strategy of becoming, then it cannot be meant for the mind that still wants to make a home out of those things. If the current of the Dharma flows toward cooling, relinquishment, disenchantment, and peace beyond compulsive craving, then who can actually hear it without resistance? Who can receive it not as an attack, but as rescue? If the Dharma moves against the grain of the world, then who is it actually for? It is for one kind of person only, the person who has begun to feel tired in a way the world cannot fix. Not tired because one plan failed, not tired because one lover left, not tired because money ran short, health declined, reputation cracked, or life became temporarily unkind. That kind of disappointment is real, yes, but it is still narrow. It still believes the wound is in the event. It still whispers, if only this one thing were repaired, then I could rest. If only the right person came, the right opportunity opened, the right season returned, then peace would be possible. But the one who is ready for liberation is tired at the root. Is a deeper exhaustion. It does not come from one sorrow. It comes from seeing the pattern that keeps manufacturing sorrows. It is not merely pain over what happened. It is insight into the machinery that makes happening itself so unstable. It is not just frustration with this life's particular drama. It is weariness toward the entire revolving movement of craving, becoming, losing, grieving, reaching again, and being thrown once more into uncertainty. That is the person this teaching serves. Because the Dharma, in its deepest sense, is not here to help us decorate the prison cell. It is not here to make bondage more elegant, more poetic, more respectable, more comfortable, or more spiritually flavored. It is not here to help us suffer with better vocabulary. It is here to show the exit. And only someone who truly wants out can hear that without resentment. A person who is merely upset still wants a revised version of the same game, a better round, a kinder fate, a more favorable arrangement of conditions. They want relief but not release. They want the burning to stop, but they still want the fuel. They want a safer dream, not awakening from dreaming. That is why temporary sadness should not be confused with spiritual weariness. A person can be heartbroken and still be deeply intoxicated with becoming. A person can be depressed and still cling fiercely to identity, achievement, romance, status, and future possibility. A person can speak in dark tones about life and still secretly cherish the hope that somewhere, somehow, existence will finally deliver what it has not yet delivered. That is not yet disenchantment in the liberating sense. That is often wounded desire, not freedom from desire. Deep weariness is different. It does not say, I am unhappy because this chapter was painful. It says, I am beginning to understand that every chapter written under craving carries the seed of fear. It does not ask merely for a happier storyline. It begins to question the compulsion to keep entering stories at all. This is why the true seeker of liberation is not simply someone who has suffered. Everyone has suffered. Nearly everyone has wept, lost, feared, and broken. Suffering alone does not turn the mind toward freedom. Sometimes suffering only makes craving more desperate. Sometimes pain makes us cling harder, bargain harder, dream harder, consume harder. Sometimes it drives us not into wisdom, but deeper into hunger. The one fit for this path is the one whose suffering has matured into seeing. Seeing that whatever arises passes. Seeing that whatever is gained must be guarded. Seeing that whatever is guarded becomes a source of anxiety. Seeing that whatever is loved in time will change, fade, slip, fracture, or vanish. Seeing that the mind, even in moments of delight, trembles underneath because it knows delight cannot be held. Seeing that becoming itself is unstable from top to bottom, and once that seeing deepens, a certain honesty begins. Very quiet, very intimate. One no longer flatters oneself with noble-sounding desires. One begins to admit, maybe I have not wanted freedom. Maybe what I wanted was refined pleasure. Maybe what I wanted was spiritual prestige. Maybe what I wanted was to suffer less while remaining the same kind of being who continues to chase, build, defend, and return. This honesty matters, because as long as one still longs for a pleasant rebirth, a heavenly afterlife, a beautiful continuation, a cleaner and brighter version of worldly satisfaction, the aspiration for liberation is still incomplete. It may be admirable in a conventional sense. It may even be morally superior to coarser ambitions. But it is not yet the full turning away that the path to release requires. To want heavenly pleasure is still to want experience. To want a fortunate rebirth is still to want continuation. To want subtler joy, finer beauty, longer delight, more luminous identity is still to remain enchanted by becoming. It is still to say yes to the wheel, provided the next turn is smoother than the last. But the liberating vision asks for something more radical than that. It asks whether any conditioned existence, however elevated, can truly satisfy. Whether anything born can escape ending. Whether anything assembled can avoid coming apart. Whether any state dependent on causes can stand beyond vulnerability. And if the answer is no, then the heart begins to understand why even the most exquisite form of becoming cannot be the final aim. This is not nihilism, it is not bitterness, it is not self-hatred. It is not a dramatic refusal of life because one has been hurt too many times. Renunciation, in the Buddhist sense, is not a tantrum against reality. It is not disgust at oneself as a person. It is not contempt for the world as an object. It is lucid exhaustion with instability. It is a sober refusal to keep asking permanence from what cannot provide it. There is gentleness in that, even if at first it sounds severe. A person who begins to renounce is not necessarily saying, everything is horrible. More deeply, they are saying, everything conditioned is unreliable, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. They are not denying that there are pleasures. Of course, there are pleasures. There is beauty, tenderness, youth, affection, music, victory, comfort, intimacy, success, sweetness, and moments of astonishing grace. The point is not to lie about their existence. The point is to see their nature clearly. Pleasure passes, beauty alters, health falters, love is shadowed by change, praise turns, identity shifts, memory thins, possessions scatter, body tire, minds flicker. Even while joy is being enjoyed, loss is already woven into it. To see this clearly is not pessimism. It is maturity. The immature mind says, do not speak to me of endings. Let me enjoy the illusion. The ripening mind says, because endings are certain, let me understand what does not end. The immature mind asks the world to become trustworthy. The ripening mind realizes that instability is woven into the world's fabric, and so it turns toward that which is not fabricated. This is why the true seeker is not just weary of pain, but weary of the whole arrangement that makes pain inevitable again and again. Not merely weary of sickness, but of the structure in which a body must age. Not merely weary of grief, but of attachment under ignorance. Not merely weary of losing things, but of becoming the kind of being who must endlessly acquire and lose. There comes a point where one no longer romanticizes return. One no longer says, may I come back but under better conditions. One no longer dreams, may I be reborn among beauty, wealth, intelligence, admiration, power, celestial delight. Because one begins to suspect that all these are only more decorated forms of exposure, more polished forms of dependence, more elegant forms of impermanence. And when that suspicion ripens into conviction, the heart changes direction. It does not become cold, it becomes clear. It does not become anti-life in some theatrical way. It simply stops worshipping what cannot last. It stops kneeling before the next promise. It stops asking the unstable to become safe. It stops confusing intensity with truth. This shift can look almost invisible from the outside. A person may still work, speak, care for others, fulfill duties, smile, rest, and move through ordinary life, but inwardly something profound has changed. The spell of becoming has weakened, the old seduction has lost color. The world still appears, but it no longer commands the same faith. That is the beginning of real fitness for the path, because now the teachings on letting go no longer sound like deprivation, they sound like medicine. The teachings on restraint no longer sound like suppression, they sound like protection. The teachings on disenchantment no longer sound gloomy, they sound honest. The teachings on cessation no longer sound like annihilation, they sound like peace. Before this weariness matures, the mind keeps negotiating. It says, I want awakening, but not at the cost of my favorite attachments. I want truth, but not if it exposes my deepest cravings. I want peace, but I also want to continue being fascinated by the very things that disturb me. This divided mind may admire the Dharma, study it, quote it, defend it, even teach it in elegant language, and yet still not be ready for its center, because the center asks for more than admiration. It asks for relinquishment, and relinquishment only becomes intelligible when fascination has begun to fail. So the one person this teaching truly serves is the one who has grown weary beyond mood, beyond event, beyond biography, the one who has suffered enough to start asking, not how do I get a better experience, but why am I still bound to the engine of experience itself? The one who no longer seeks merely a softer chain, a brighter rebirth, a more noble identity, a more spiritual pleasure. The one who has begun sincerely to fear repeated birth and death not as a doctrine, not as a slogan, but as a direct existential burden. This fear is not panic, it is wisdom in its early trembling form. It is the mind finally sobering up to what it has long normalized. It is the heart admitting that endless return is not a gift when ignorance continues to govern the return. It is the dawning recognition that no amount of rearrangement within the cycle can equal freedom from the cycle. And yet even this weariness, precious as it is only the threshold, because many can become disgusted with obvious pain, with heartbreak, with humiliation, with decay in its roughest forms. Many can recoil from gross suffering. Many can say, I do not want this kind of misery again. But this weariness must be sharpened further, because the teaching here does not stop at disliking gross suffering. It asks us to examine even subtle existence. And this is exactly where the teaching becomes difficult in a way that almost shocks the ordinary mind. It is one thing to be tired of visible pain. It is one thing to be afraid of sickness, old age, betrayal, loss, failure, loneliness, or death in the crude forms we all recognize. Anyone who has been crushed by life can say, at least for a moment, I do not want this again. But the Buddha's standard goes much further than that. It is not satisfied with our dislike of the rougher edges of existence. It asks whether we have seen deeply enough to become weary even of the most refined forms of becoming. That is why the old masters speak in such a severe way. They say that if one truly fears samsara, one must reach the point where even a single minute of breathing in the life of an arahant is still understood as dukkha, still understood as something not ultimately secure, still understood as belonging to conditioned existence. Now listen carefully. Because this can be misunderstood very easily. This is not a criticism of the arahant. It is not a dismissal of awakening. It is not saying that the life of an awakened being is impure, agitated, or comparable to the feverish confusion of ordinary people. Not at all, the difference is immeasurable. The mind of an arahant is liberated from greed, hatred, and delusion. There is no intoxication there, no craving there, no self-making there. Compared to our condition, it is beyond comparison. And yet, as long as there is still the functioning of conditioned phenomena, as long as there is still breath moving in and out, as long as there is still the remainder of a lived life unfolding through causes and conditions, the Buddha does not ask us to call that the final thing to cling to. He does not ask us to romanticize even that. He does not tell us to fall in love with existence merely because it has become purified. That is the sharpness here. A minute of an arahant's breathing is not defiled, but breathing is still a conditioned process. In-breath, out-breath, body, contact, feeling, the ongoing mechanics of a life still present in the world, however pure, however peaceful, however noble, still belong to what has arisen dependent on conditions. And whatever is conditioned cannot be the ultimate refuge. Whatever depends on arising cannot be identical with the unshakable safety beyond arising. This is why the statement sounds so extreme to us, because our instinct is always to search for some version of existence that can finally satisfy us. If not coarse pleasure, then refined pleasure. If not worldly success, then spiritual beauty. If not noisy happiness, then elegant peace. The mind always wants to rescue some corner of becoming and say, surely this one is enough. Surely this form can remain. Surely this is safe to keep. But the Buddha's vision leaves no room for that last intoxication. If even the purest lived existence is not to be clung to, then what about our own life, burning with wants, fears, fantasies, resentments, vanity, and endless hunger? If even the most exalted humanly imaginable condition is still not the final resting place, then how much less should we decorate our own restlessness and call it meaningful security? This is where the teaching begins to cut through sentimentality. We are so easily charmed by being alive, not because life is always beautiful, but because craving can make even suffering feel negotiable. We tell ourselves that if only a few things improved, then this ongoing round would become acceptable. If only the body were healthier, if only the relationship were repaired, if only we had more money, more beauty, more time, more recognition, more tenderness, more control, then we imagine we would know how to live then. Perhaps samsara would not seem so terrible, but as long as the mind still whispers, I still want this, I still want that, the fear of samsara has not yet ripened. It has not penetrated to the subtle level. It has not become intelligent enough, because that wanting is the proof that we are still bargaining with the fire. We are still trying to make a home inside instability. We are still trying to arrange the prison furniture more tastefully. We are still asking the wheel to spin in a gentler way, instead of asking whether spinning itself is the problem. The teaching here is not trying to make us miserable. It is trying to make us honest. If I still secretly believe that some form of rebirth, some form of continuity, some form of renewed experience might finally give me what I want, then I have not yet seen the full danger. I may respect the Dharma. I may admire the Buddha. I may enjoy spiritual language, but I have not yet turned the heart toward release with full seriousness. I am still negotiating. I am still keeping a little altar hidden inside the mind for future existence. And that hidden altar is built out of preference. I want beauty. I want tenderness. I want health. I want significance. I want to be seen. I want to enjoy. I want to continue. I want becoming, but only the pleasant kind. This is why true disenchantment sounds almost ruthless at first, because it does not merely reject hellish forms of life. It does not merely recoil from visible agony. It sees that wherever there is birth, there is vulnerability. Wherever there is arising, there is passing. Wherever there is form, there is exposure. Wherever there is experience woven out of conditions, there is no final guarantee. Even sublime existence cannot solve the problem of existence by being sublime. And this is a very hard thing to hear if the heart is still romantic about life. We think breathing is innocent. We think, what could be more simple than this? A breath in, a breath out, quiet, gentle, almost sacred. And in one sense, yes, it is peaceful. In meditation, breath can calm the mind. Breath can steady us. Breath can become an object of profound clarity. But the point being made here is more radical than that. It is saying, do not mistake calm process for ultimate freedom. Do not mistake subtle continuity for final release. Do not call conditioned peace the same thing as the end of all bondage. Even 1 minute of breathing, if it belongs to conditioned life, cannot be the highest good again, not because there is something ugly about the arahant, but because the Buddha's standard of liberation is unimaginably exact. He does not lower the goal to suit our attachment. He does not flatter our taste for existence. He does not say, keep just a little bit of becoming and call it enough. He points beyond all of it. And if that feels severe, it is because we are still measuring with the scale of desire. Desire says, but surely there must be something here worth keeping. Wisdom says, anything that arises and ceases cannot bear the burden of ultimate refuge. Desire says, let me improve the experience. Wisdom says, see the nature of experience itself. Desire says, I only want the beautiful part. Wisdom says, even the beautiful part is unstable. Desire says, at least let me remain. Wisdom says, that very urge to remain is the thread binding you to sorrow. So the teaching is not asking us to become cold or dramatic. It is asking us to refine our perception until subtle attachment becomes visible. That is much harder than rejecting obvious pain. Obvious pain pushes people away on its own. Refined attachment hides beneath spiritual admiration, beneath noble ideals, beneath quiet pleasures, beneath harmless seeming preferences. It survives by becoming delicate. That is why so many people can speak about letting go while still cherishing continuity. So many can talk about peace while still wanting experience. So many can admire saints while secretly wanting a more polished version of samsara. But if fear of samsara becomes deep enough, even polished samsara is still samsara. Even luminous samsara is still samsara. Even dignified samsara is still samsara. As long as there is the notion, may I still have a little of this, a little of that. The work is not done. The heart has not yet been fully sobered. It still imagines that somewhere within the field of conditions, there is a pocket of lasting satisfaction waiting to be discovered. There is great tenderness in seeing this clearly, because we begin to understand our own predicament without pretending. We see why the mind runs. We see why it clings. We see why it tires but does not stop. We see why, even after pain, it still asks for another arrangement. And once this is seen, the Dhamma becomes far more serious, not gloomy but serious, not despairing but uncompromising. Then the question is no longer, how can I get a better life inside the wheel? The question becomes, what is this wheel really, and why do I keep calling it home? And once that question opens in the heart, the Buddha's severe language begins to make sense. Because he is not condemning life in bitterness. He is revealing the instability we keep decorating. He is exposing the danger we keep sentimentalizing. He is refusing to let us settle for elegance inside bondage. If a person can feel the force of that, then practice changes, listening changes, renunciation changes, even faith changes. It is no longer a search for blessings within becoming, but a longing to understand release from becoming. It is no longer merely, may my life go well. It becomes more deeply, may I truly see what binds the mind, and may I stop worshipping what cannot save me. That is a very different spiritual mood, and from there, one begins to understand why the masters say that as long as we still crave this and that, as long as the heart still reaches outward with appetite, fear of birth and death has not yet reached its mature form. We may be frightened by pain, yes. We may be exhausted by disappointment, yes. But mature disenchantment appears only when the mind no longer trusts any conditioned thing to deliver final safety. That is a frightening threshold, but also a liberating one, because when the illusions around refined existence begin to crack, then the heart becomes available for a deeper kind of freedom. Not the freedom of getting what it wants, but the freedom of no longer being fooled by wanting. And to make that severity more vivid, the tradition gives us one of the starkest images of all. The Buddha says, human filth does not stop being filth, because there is less of it. Whether it lies there in a great heap, foul and obvious, or whether it is only a tiny smear clinging to the tip of a stick, it remains exactly what it is, smaller yes, less visible maybe, less offensive to the eye perhaps, but not pure, not beautiful, not worthy of attachment. Its quantity does not change its nature. That image is intentionally hard. It is not meant to flatter the mind. It is not meant to soothe our preferences. It is meant to strike at a very deep habit in us. The habit of believing that if suffering becomes more elegant, then somehow it is no longer suffering. The habit of believing that if bondage becomes refined enough, then maybe it can be called freedom. But the teaching refuses that compromise. A miserable life full of confusion, addiction, humiliation, fear, sickness, and loss is dukkha. Most people can accept that much. They look at obvious pain and say, yes, of course, that is suffering. But a life that is graceful, cultured, respected, healthy, attractive, intelligent, comfortable, even radiant by worldly standards, that too remains within the same field of conditioned existence. It may be smoother, it may be gentler, it may be more pleasurable, it may be full of dignity and light. But if it is still conditioned, still dependently arisen, still vulnerable to ending, still built upon contact, feeling, craving and clinging, then it cannot be the final refuge. This is the point many hearts resist. We think, surely there must be a difference. Surely a life of torment and a life of beauty cannot be spoken of in the same breath. Surely a brutal existence and a refined one should not be placed under one uncompromising truth. And in a relative sense, yes, there is a difference. Buddhism never denies relative difference. It does not say that agony and comfort feel the same. It does not say that confusion and clarity are equal in practical life. It does not say there is no distinction between a hellish state and a heavenly one. There is a distinction, a great one. The teachings are not blind to that, but the point here is more radical than comparison. The point is not that all experiences feel identical. The point is that all conditioned experiences share the same unstable structure. All of them arise, all of them pass. All of them lean on causes they do not control. All of them contain vulnerability inside their very appearance. And because of that, none of them can bear the weight of ultimate trust. That is why the simile is so severe. A large heap or a tiny smear, the eye sees degrees but wisdom sees nature. In the same way, coarse existence and subtle existence may differ in intensity, in beauty, in longevity, in refinement, in pleasure, in mental brightness. But as long as there is becoming, as long as there is the continuity of conditioned presence, as long as there is something fabricated and maintained, then there is still instability. There is still the pressure of change. There is still the hidden crack running through it all. This is what the worldly mind does not want to hear. Because the worldly mind is always negotiating. It says, fine, maybe I cannot have perfect permanence. But can I at least have a better version of impermanence? Can I at least have a cleaner suffering, a more polished suffering, a more noble suffering? Can I at least keep the pleasant forms of becoming and only remove the painful ones? And the Dhamma answers with extraordinary honesty. If what you seek is liberation, then no, that compromise will not do. Because what you are still asking for is not freedom from the wheel. You are asking for a more attractive place on the wheel. That is why this image should not be heard as cruelty. It is compassion speaking in a voice that refuses to lie. If a doctor knows that a sweetness is poisoned, kindness is not found in saying, eat a little but elegantly. Real kindness is telling the truth even when the patient does not enjoy hearing it. In the same way, the Buddha is not trying to make us hate life in a dramatic or neurotic sense. He is not trying to make us disgusted with appearances for the sake of disgust itself. He is trying to free us from intoxication. There is a difference. Disgust for its own sake can become another bondage. It can become aversion, depression, contempt, even spiritual vanity. But disenchantment is something else. Disenchantment is the cooling of fascination. It is the sobering of a mind that finally sees. This cannot keep its promise. This cannot stay. This cannot protect me. This cannot be held without fear. And when that understanding deepens, attraction begins to loosen on its own. That is the purpose of the image, not to stain the heart, but to unhook it. Because what keeps being circling is not merely pain, it is seduction. Not only the sharp pain we fear, but the subtle sweetness we still admire. Not only the obvious burden, but the polished burden we continue to call meaningful, beautiful, or worth repeating. As long as the mind remains enchanted by conditioned existence, it will keep returning to it. It will keep decorating it. It will keep bargaining with it. It will keep saying, maybe next time it will satisfy me. There is another old image that carries the same weight. A traveler crossing a desert finds a well, and beside the well, a single ripe fruit hanging from a low branch. He is thirsty and tired, so he drinks, and he eats. And for a moment the relief feels like salvation. But the well is fed by a hidden spring that will run dry within the year, and the fruit is the last one the tree will ever bear, because its roots are already dying beneath the sand. The traveler does not know this. He only feels the sweetness on his tongue and the coolness in his throat, and he tells himself he has found an oasis worth staying for. He builds a small shelter under the tree. He begins to call this place home. He is not foolish in the way people usually mean that word. He is simply unaware that comfort and permanence are not the same thing, and that a resting place can be real without being reliable. This is how the mind treats most of what it calls good fortune. It mistakes a temporary mercy for a lasting foundation, and it settles in before asking whether the ground beneath it can hold. And so the teaching cuts through the glamour at the root. Whether existence appears brutal or refined, frantic or peaceful, vulgar or elevated, it is still marked by birth, aging, and death. It is still exposed to separation from what is loved and union with what is not loved. It is still dependent on unstable conditions. It is still vulnerable to fear as long as there is something to lose. Even the most exalted state, if conditioned, cannot stand beyond dissolution. That last part is difficult for many people because we instinctively equate subtlety with safety. If something is spiritually impressive, emotionally elevated, aesthetically beautiful, intellectually profound, or cosmically luminous, we assume it must be closer to final truth. Sometimes it is closer in the sense that it supports clarity, restraint, concentration, virtue. But if the mind secretly turns even refinement into an object of possession, then the old pattern remains intact. The texture is finer, but the chain is still a chain. This is why the masters speak so firmly about not trusting becoming itself. A filthy thing does not become clean by shrinking. A prison does not become liberation by being decorated. A fire does not stop burning because its flame turns blue and beautiful. In the same way, samsaric existence does not become unconditioned peace merely because it appears noble, bright, or subtle. And people who have not studied deeply, contemplated repeatedly, or practiced mindfulness seriously enough often find this language excessive. It sounds too dark, too absolute, too sharp. It can even sound insulting to life itself. Why? Because ordinarily we do not see process. We see episodes. We do not see the machinery of craving and becoming. We see moments that please us and call them worthwhile. We do not see how contact gives rise to feeling, how feeling conditions wanting, how wanting builds identity, how identity leans toward becoming, how becoming binds the mind again and again to birth and death. Without careful observation, all of that remains hidden, and when the mechanism is hidden, the verdict of the Buddha sounds exaggerated. Of course it does. If all you see is a beautiful face, a successful career, a loving embrace, a peaceful afternoon, a moment of inspiration to mind, then to hear someone say, "Even this is not the refuge," can sound cold and unnatural. But that is because ordinary perception stops at the surface of the experience. It does not yet track the instability beneath it. It does not follow the fading, the dependency, the vulnerability, the subtle pressure of maintenance, the fear of interruption, the hunger for repetition. Mindfulness begins to reveal those hidden layers. With enough honesty, you start to notice that even pleasure contains tension. Even success carries anxiety. Even intimacy trembles with uncertainty. Even health ages while it is being enjoyed. Even praise has a shadow in the fear of blame. Even spiritual joy, if clung to, becomes another source of restlessness. The more carefully you watch, the more you begin to understand why the Buddha spoke in this uncompromising way. Not because he was hostile to beings, but because he saw more deeply into what beings call happiness. He saw the instability woven into the fabric. He saw that what the world celebrates, it also loses. What it acquires, it must defend. What it loves, it must grieve. What it constructs, it must maintain. What it identifies with, it must fear for. And because he saw that completely, he would not bless our intoxication with soft words. Still, his purpose is tender. He is not asking us to panic at existence. He is not asking us to cultivate horror as a personality. He is asking us to wake up from enchantment, to stop leaning with our full heart against what cannot hold, to stop kneeling before what is already passing away, to stop calling temporary shelter an eternal home. When understood that way, the image of filth becomes less like an insult and more like a rescue. It tells us, with startling force, that no amount of polishing can transform the conditioned into the unconditioned. No degree of refinement can make the unstable finally secure. No elegant arrangement of arising and passing can become deathless peace. And that is a painful truth only for the part of us that still wants to be deceived. For the wiser part, the tired part, the honest part, it is relief. Relief that someone finally spoke without seduction. Relief that someone finally refused to romanticize the wheel. Relief that someone finally showed us why even the most beautiful patterns of becoming are still patterns, still woven, still dependent, still subject to unraveling. This is not a rejection of relative goodness. We should still choose virtue over harm, clarity over confusion, compassion over cruelty, restraint over indulgence. These matter immensely. They shape the path. They protect the mind. They create the conditions in which deeper seeing becomes possible. But none of them are meant to be mistaken for the final goal. They are supports for release, not ornaments for continued fascination. And unless this point is understood, the spiritual life becomes confused. We begin using the path to beautify samsara instead of transcending it. We use meditation to become more comfortable inside impermanence. We use wisdom language to decorate craving. We use merit to negotiate for more pleasing forms of return. And then the deepest edge of the Buddha's message is lost. So the image remains deliberately unsettling. Whether vast or tiny, gross or subtle, obvious or refined, what is conditioned cannot become the deathless simply by becoming more attractive. That is the warning. That is the medicine. That is the compassion hidden inside the severity. Still, many listeners will recoil from such language, because ordinary perception is trained to chase charm, not to examine structure. And if one has not yet looked closely enough at the mind, at craving, at repetition, at the enormous imbalance between our ideals and our actual habits, then this vision can seem almost impossible to accept. That is why the next step is to look directly at common human experience and ask, very plainly, why this teaching sounds so hard to believe in the first place. And this is exactly the point where many people pull back. They hear the Buddha speak about birth, aging, illness, death, repetition, craving, and the burden of being reborn again and again, and something inside them resists immediately. It sounds too harsh, too dark, too unforgiving, too joyless. To the ordinary ear, it can almost feel like an attack on life itself. People think, how can this be wisdom? How can this be compassion? Why speak about existence in such severe terms when life also has beauty, tenderness, affection, success, family, music, laughter, and rest? That reaction is understandable, very understandable, because most people do not evaluate life by looking at its total structure. They evaluate life by flashes, by moments, by brief sweetness, by isolated relief. A good meal, a loving embrace, a beautiful memory, a successful day, a season of health, a moment of recognition, a little comfort, a little romance, a little hope. And once the mind catches these bright fragments, it stitches them together into a story and calls that story life. Then it protects that story fiercely. But the Buddha was not speaking from fragments. He was speaking from structure. He was not hypnotized by the little intervals of pleasure scattered through the field of suffering. He was looking at the whole machinery, the arising of desire, the effort to satisfy it, the fear of losing what is gained, the frustration of not getting what is wanted, the exhaustion of defending identity, the anxiety hidden inside attachment, the instability of everything conditioned, and the certainty that whatever is born must pass. His seriousness did not come from pessimism. It came from precision that is hard for untrained perception to appreciate. If a person has not studied Dhamma carefully, then cause and effect remain vague. Life seems random, accident, emotional, personal, one says. I feel this, I like that, I hate this, I hope for that, but does not really see the lawful pattern underneath. One does not see how greed breeds agitation, how aversion breeds heat, how delusion breeds blindness, how attachment breeds fear, how becoming breeds further becoming. One experiences the symptom but not the mechanism. And if the mechanism is not seen, then the Buddha's diagnosis sounds exaggerated. If a person has not reflected deeply on doctrine, then even very basic truths remain merely decorative. Impermanence is heard as a nice religious idea. Unsatisfactoriness is heard as a philosophical mood. Not self is heard as an abstract puzzle. But these are not ornaments in the Buddha's teaching. They are descriptions of reality. And if they are not examined, tested, and brought into one's own direct vision, then life continues to appear more solid, more manageable, and more promising than it really is. And if a person has not practiced sustained mindfulness, then the mind is almost never seen clearly enough to be trusted as a witness. This is so important. Without mindfulness, what do we actually know about our own life? Very little. We know the stories we tell. We know the moods that dominate us. We know the memories the mind prefers to keep. But the mind without training is a terrible historian. It edits constantly. It omits, polishes, excuses, and rearranges. It remembers sweetness vividly and suffering selectively. It magnifies pleasure and normalizes danger. It treats repetition as familiarity and familiarity as safety. It converts brief relief into evidence that samsara is worth continuing. This is how ignorance protects itself. A person suffers, struggles, worries, envies, fears, burns with desire, gets disappointed, ages, loses sleep, loses health, loses opportunity, loses people, loses direction, loses dignity, and still, because there were a few lovely moments in between, the mind concludes, life is still good, existence is still desirable, another round would be acceptable, maybe even wonderful if conditions improve. But why does the mind conclude that? Because it does not calculate honestly. It does not weigh pleasure and pain with clarity. It does not ask how long pleasure lasts, what it costs to obtain, what fear accompanies its preservation, and what grief follows its loss. It does not ask how many unwholesome states were stirred up just to secure one small satisfaction. It does not ask how much restlessness, comparison, vanity, resentment, ambition, lust, and insecurity fill the average day. It looks at the polished moments and forgets the hidden invoice. That hidden invoice is what the Buddha kept pointing to, not because he hated beauty, not because he despised human feeling, not because he wanted to crush hope, but because he refused to lie about the terms of conditioned existence. He would not let a pleasant surface cancel the unstable foundation beneath it. He would not let temporary charm disguise deep vulnerability. He would not let beings drift along under the spell of selective attention and call that wisdom. So when people say, this teaching is too extreme, what they often mean is, this teaching is refusing to cooperate with my preferred editing of reality. That sounds strong, but look closely and see if it is not true. Ignorance is not just not knowing. Ignorance is active. It arranges experience in a way that protects craving. It tells us that because something feels good now, it must be worth clinging to. It tells us that because pain comes and goes, it is not serious. It tells us that because everyone lives like this, it must be normal. It tells us that because we have survived disappointment before, we can keep doing this indefinitely. It tells us that because death has not happened today, it can be treated as distant. It tells us that because there is laughter in the world, there is no urgency. It tells us that because there are flowers, weddings, songs, children, success and moonlight, the wheel itself is acceptable. But the Buddha asks a different question. He asks, what is the nature of all of it? Not whether there are moments of delight. Of course there are. Not whether affection exists. Of course it does. Not whether there is pleasure, beauty, intimacy, or achievement. There is. The question is whether any of it escapes instability, whether any of it can be possessed without fear, whether any of it can satisfy craving permanently. whether any of it exempts the mind from aging, loss, separation, and death, whether any conditioned experience can carry the weight we demand from it. And that is where the ordinary mind becomes uncomfortable, because it does not want analysis at that depth. It wants permission. It wants reassurance. It wants a spirituality that blesses its attachments, decorates its ambitions, and promises a more elegant version of the same old hunger. It does not want to hear that even refined existence is still bound up with vulnerability. It does not want to hear that what we call enjoyment is often only a pause between pressures. It does not want to hear that our favorite dreams are stitched together by craving and defended by delusion. This is why the Buddha's language can sound severe to those who have not trained. Without doctrinal understanding, one hears only the conclusion and misses the reasoning. Without contemplation, one hears the warning but has not seen the evidence. Without direct observation of mind and body, one hears that all conditioned existence is unsatisfactory, but inwardly compares that claim only to one's best memories, not to the actual texture of ordinary consciousness. And the actual texture of ordinary consciousness is not especially noble. It is restless, it is needy, it is unstable, it is easily offended, easily seduced, easily discouraged, easily inflated, easily frightened. It runs toward what it likes, runs from what it dislikes, and drifts in confusion through everything in between. Even when outward conditions are decent, inwardly there is pressure. Pressure to become, pressure to maintain, pressure to defend, pressure to repeat, pressure to not lose face, pressure to secure affection, pressure to avoid pain, pressure to keep the self-story alive. Yet because this pressure is constant, we stop noticing it. We call it normal. That is one of ignorance's greatest triumphs. Not merely causing suffering, but making suffering feel ordinary enough that it no longer shocks us. Once repetition has numbed sensitivity, bondage begins to feel like life itself. Then anyone who points to the chains sounds dramatic. The Buddha sounded dramatic only to minds already anesthetized. And still, even here, he is not asking for blind agreement. He is not saying, "Believe me because I said so." He is asking for careful looking. Suspend your defensiveness for a moment. Set aside the reflex to protect your preferences. Do not rush to call the teaching gloomy just because it disturbs your habits of perception. Look more carefully. Look longer. Look where the mind usually refuses to look. When pleasure arises, look also at the wanting that preceded it. When pleasure passes, look at the disappointment that follows. When fear arises around loss, look at the attachment underneath. When anger flares, look at the self-image being defended. When jealousy stings, look at the comparison shaping identity. When boredom appears, look at the addiction to stimulation. When hope feels sweet, look also at the unease hidden inside expectation. This is not cruelty. This is honesty. At first can feel severe to a mind accustomed to intoxication. The Buddha's seriousness does not come from a lack of love for beings. It comes from seeing how trapped beings are while imagining themselves free. It comes from seeing how often we celebrate the very conditions that keep us bound. It comes from seeing that what the world calls living well is very often only decorating a prison cell, perfuming instability, or negotiating for a slightly gentler form of captivity. So yes, to the untrained heart, this can sound merciless, but if you stay with it long enough, another possibility appears. Maybe what sounds harsh is not hatred of life, but refusal to flatter delusion. Maybe what sounds joyless is not denial of happiness, but recognition that fleeting pleasure is too small to build our final trust upon. Maybe what sounds dark is simply what truth sounds like before the eyes adjust. That adjustment takes time. It takes study. It takes reflection. It takes the humility to admit that our instincts may not be reliable guides. It takes repeated observation of body as body, feeling as feeling, mind as mind, and phenomena as phenomena, until the glittering surface no longer completely hypnotizes us. Then gradually, the Buddha's voice stops sounding extreme. It starts sounding exact. And once it starts sounding exact, a sobering question naturally follows. If we stop judging life by occasional pleasant flashes and begin observing it honestly as it is lived, then what kind of mind is actually ruling us through most of the day? If we stop and answer that question without decorating ourselves, without performing spirituality, without trying to sound wiser than we are, the answer is uncomfortable. In a single ordinary day, what appears more often in the mind? Greed or contentment, irritation or patience, vanity or humility, fear or courage, envy or sympathetic joy, resentment or forgiveness, fantasy or clear seeing, self-protection or compassion. For most people, if they are honest, the answer is not flattering. From morning until night, the mind is busy. It reaches, compares, reacts, defends, replays, anticipates, complains, imagines, remembers old injuries, searches for praise, fears blame, clings to pleasure, resists discomfort, and takes itself very seriously. Even when the body looks calm from the outside, the inner traffic is relentless. A person can be sitting silently in a room and still be burning with wanting, irritation, anxiety, pride, or disappointment. The noise does not have to be spoken to be real, and this is precisely the point many people do not want to examine. They prefer to judge themselves by their best moments. They remember the one kind thing they did, the one generous act, the one prayer, the one tear of sincerity. But the Buddha's teaching does not ask us to identify ourselves by rare shining exceptions. It asks us to observe frequency, tendency, habit, momentum, not what we occasionally rise to, but what we repeatedly return to. That is a much harder mirror. So look carefully. When something pleasant appears, how quickly does wanting follow? When something unpleasant appears, how quickly does resistance follow? When someone else succeeds, how often does the heart feel pure gladness? And how often does some small bitterness creep in? When criticized, how often is there simple understanding? And how often is there tightening, defensiveness, inner argument? When praised, how often is there balance? And how often does the mind secretly feed on it? This is not a sermon against you. It is not an accusation. It is an inventory. And if the inventory is accurate, then most untrained minds are not mainly governed by wisdom. They are not mainly governed by loving kindness. They are not mainly governed by renunciation. They are governed, much of the time, by impulses that narrow the heart and cloud perception. Sometimes those impulses are dramatic. Often they are subtle, a flash of jealousy, a silent comparison, a private grudge, a tiny thrill in being admired, a quick impatience with someone slow, weak, needy, or inconvenient, a wish to be comfortable at someone else's expense, a fantasy of revenge, a hunger to be seen, a fear of being ignored, a refusal to let go. None of this needs to become crime in order to be dangerous. It is dangerous already because it shapes the world we live in from the inside out. This is why plain observation is so important. If greed, irritation, vanity, fear, envy, resentment, fantasy, and selfishness visit the mind more often than clarity, generosity, patience, and compassion, then what exactly are we calling a safe existence? What are we placing our trust in? What is so stable, so noble, so clean about a life driven by these conditions? People often speak romantically about life because they are selecting memories. They remember a beautiful face, a season of youth, a success, a night of laughter, a moment when the wind felt gentle and the moon looked kind. Fine, those things exist. No one denies that pleasant moments occur, but pleasant moments are not the same as purity. They are not the same as safety. They are not the same as liberation. A life can contain sweetness and still be profoundly hazardous. In fact, the sweetness can be part of the hazard because it keeps us from looking at the whole. If a person has not trained the mind, then even their pleasures are usually mixed with agitation. Wanting is already stress. Protecting what one has is stress. Fearing loss is stress. Comparing one's pleasure with another's pleasure is stress. Trying to repeat yesterday's satisfaction is stress. So even in what people call happiness, there is instability, there is dependence, there is vulnerability, there is the constant possibility that the thing enjoyed will change, fade, disappoint, or demand a price. Now add to that the ordinary moral weather inside the average person. How much pettiness in one day, how much restlessness, how much self-importance, how much unconscious cruelty through neglect, indifference, carelessness, gossip, manipulation, or emotional laziness again. This is not about monsters. This is about normal people, respectable people, educated people, religious people, family people, people who would never think of themselves as bad. But what is bad in practice? Is it only murder and theft? Or is it also the repeated cultivation of greed, ill will, conceit, and delusion? Is it also living one's whole life from habit without examining the consequences? Is it also smiling while inwardly competing, serving while inwardly calculating, speaking softly while inwardly burning? If we are serious, we have to admit that the unwholesome mind does not always look ugly from the outside. Sometimes it is very polished, sometimes it is charming, sometimes it is successful, sometimes it is socially rewarded. That is why the danger of existence is not obvious to the intoxicated eye. The world does not always punish defilement immediately. Often it dresses it well. And because of that, people keep believing that worldly life is basically trustworthy if handled intelligently. They imagine that with enough money, enough health, enough attractiveness, enough influence, enough romance, enough convenience, enough good timing, things will be fine. But the problem is deeper than circumstances. The problem is the mind using those circumstances. Put wealth into an untrained mind, and greed grows elegant. Put beauty into an untrained mind, and vanity becomes a religion. Put power into an untrained mind, and harm becomes efficient. Put insecurity into an untrained mind, and relationships become cages. So if one's own heart is already unstable, already vulnerable to delusion, already repeatedly leaning towards selfishness and confusion, then stepping into the world does not solve the problem. It extends it. It multiplies the field in which that confusion can act. We do not enter a pure world with an impure mind and somehow come out safe. We carry our mind into every room, every relationship, every decision, every reaction. And then, together with countless other untrained minds doing exactly the same thing, we call the result life. Look around with that in view. Why is there so much betrayal, so much exploitation, so much deception, so much loneliness in the middle of company, so much fear inside comfort, so much bitterness inside privilege? Because the world is not built only from landscapes and weather and architecture. It is built from minds. And if minds are mostly clouded, then the world they generate cannot be relied upon as a field of lasting goodness. This is why the Buddha's seriousness about birth and death is not pessimism, it is clarity. If in one single day we can barely keep the mind from drifting toward greed, annoyance, fantasy, pride, fear, and self-concern, then what confidence should we have in endless return? If this is the machinery operating now, what exactly are we hoping for by continuing in it? More chances to cling, more chances to resent, more chances to chase and lose, more chances to wound and be wounded, while occasionally decorating the cycle with a little pleasure. That should sober a person. And notice, this reflection does not require abstract philosophy. You do not need to debate cosmology to feel the weight of it. You only need honesty. You only need to watch your own mind from breakfast to bedtime. See how quickly it gets offended. See how easily it gets seduced. See how often it daydreams instead of knowing. See how much of its activity circles around me, mine, for me, against me, what I want, what I fear, how I appear, what I deserve. Then ask, if this is the average condition, what is the statistical direction of such a life? Toward freedom or toward more entanglement? Most people do not like this kind of reflection because it punctures sentimental optimism. It interrupts the fantasy that worldly existence is mostly a neutral playground with a few unfortunate problems around the edges. No. The instability is built in. The vulnerability is built in. The moral danger is built in. Not because creation is evil in some dramatic sense, but because an untrained mind being conditioned existence again and again will keep manufacturing suffering again and again. This is why the path is not meant for someone still intoxicated with becoming. If a person still deeply believes that another round of existence will finally arrange itself into lasting satisfaction, they will hear teachings on renunciation as excessive. They will hear caution as negativity. They will hear dispassion as emotional poverty. Why? Because they still have hope in the wrong place. They still imagine there is something here worth building a final home upon. But for someone who has begun to observe carefully, the mood changes. They may still smile. They may still love. They may still work, serve, and care for others. But underneath, something sobers. They no longer assume that the stream of existence is harmless. They no longer romanticize their own mind. They see how rare true purity is. They see how difficult it is to sustain one wholesome state without interruption. They see how swiftly the mind falls from clarity into craving, from kindness into impatience, from humility into self-reference. And this seeing is not meant to produce despair. It is meant to produce urgency, honesty, and a wise turning. Because if the problem is this intimate, this frequent, this woven into the texture of daily consciousness, then the solution cannot be casual. It cannot be decorative religion. It cannot be spiritual language laid over an unchanged life. It has to be training. It has to be restraint. It has to be mindfulness. It has to be deep enough to challenge the very instincts we have been obeying for lifetimes. Once that inner imbalance is admitted, the outer world begins to look different too. Its glitter loses some authority. Its promises sound less convincing. And from there, we are finally able to ask a more serious question. If the mind is this compromised, and the world is shaped by minds like this, then what are the real odds of living well by drifting along as we are? If the mind is this unstable within one person, then we should not be surprised when the larger human world reflects the same instability on a massive scale. Society is not something floating above us, pure and abstract. It is built out of minds. It is shaped by intentions, fears, hungers, jealousies, ambitions, fantasies, and wounds. The world we live in is not separate from consciousness. It is consciousness multiplied, organized, rewarded, institutionalized. So if in one single day we can barely keep greed, irritation, vanity, resentment, and anxiety from coloring our thoughts, then what exactly do we imagine the world will look like when billions of beings are doing the same thing at once? This is where the teaching becomes painfully practical. We do not even need to begin with metaphysical claims. We can start with ordinary honesty. In a single day, what appears in the mind more often? Generosity or grasping, patience or irritation, clarity or confusion, rejoicing in others' good fortune or quiet comparison, forgiveness or replayed injury. If a person is sincere, the answer is not flattering. Even when we are decent by worldly standards, the undercurrent is still unstable. We want things, we fear losing things, we defend images, we chase approval, we resist discomfort, we negotiate for advantage. We drift toward what pleases us and harden against what threatens us. This is already the daily weather of an unliberated mind. Now extend that outward. If I am like this and you are like this, and most people around us are also living under the pressure of craving and delusion, then the world cannot help but take that shape. It will produce systems of competition because craving competes. It will produce deception because fear hides. It will produce vanity because insecurity needs witnesses. It will produce aggression because ego cannot bear friction. It will produce exploitation because desire does not like limits. Even kindness in such a world is often mixed with self-interest. Even loyalty is often conditional. Even moral language is sometimes just ambition dressed in virtue. That is why the Buddha speaks so sternly about samsara. Not because he is pessimistic, not because he hates life, but because he sees what life becomes when it is driven by untrained minds. And untrained minds are the rule, not the exception. We romanticize humanity because we are attached to it. We celebrate the bright moments and edit out the rest. But if we look carefully, most beings are not guided by wisdom. They are pushed by impulse. They are steered by habit. They are captivated by appearance. They are wounded, defensive, hungry, frightened, and often unaware of how much harm they spread simply by living from confusion. So when people ask why this world feels unstable, why there is so much betrayal, manipulation, noise, pressure, loneliness, and moral exhaustion, the answer is not mysterious. The world made by minds like ours will always lean in that direction. Even our achievements carry the fingerprints of agitation. We build but often from restlessness. We connect but often from need. We speak but often to control an impression. We work but often under compulsion. We love but often with attachment, fear, and possessiveness mixed in. The problem is not just that bad people exist somewhere out there. The deeper problem is that the roots of harm are ordinary. They are intimate. They are familiar. They are in here. And because that is true, the opportunities for wrongdoing are everywhere. They do not arrive only as crimes or scandals. They appear in tiny openings all day long. A half-truth to protect an image, a cold silence meant to punish, a sweetness used to gain influence, a moment of envy hidden behind a smile, a pleasure taken in someone else's failure, a willingness to ignore injustice because speaking would cost us something, a compromise made not from wisdom, but from weakness, a convenience purchased with another being's suffering, a habit of gossip, a habit of contempt, a habit of using people emotionally while still calling it love. The channels of unwholesomeness are many because craving is inventive and self-protection is quick. Now compare that with the conditions required for something truly wholesome, for a genuinely skillful action to arise. Many things often have to come together. There has to be enough mindfulness to notice what is happening. There has to be enough honesty to admit the unwholesome pull. There has to be enough restraint not to obey it immediately. There has to be enough patience to bear discomfort. There has to be enough wisdom to remember consequences. There has to be enough courage to go against pressure, enough kindness to think beyond oneself, enough steadiness not to be seduced by short-term gain. In some moments that happens, it can happen. Human goodness is real, but look at how delicate the conditions are. Look at how easily they collapse. A person may begin the day with good intention, and by noon one insult, one fear, one temptation, one disappointment, one remembered grievance is enough to tilt the whole inner climate. A person may want to act ethically, but then desire speaks, anger speaks, insecurity speaks, old conditioning speaks, the group speaks, the family system speaks, the market speaks, the body speaks, social reward speaks, and what began as sincerity gets negotiated away. This is not because people are monsters. It is because ignorance is deep and pressure is constant. That is what makes samsaric existence dangerous. Not merely painful in some poetic sense, but structurally dangerous. We are born into an environment where the causes of heedlessness are abundant and the causes of awakening are scarce. There are countless invitations to distraction, but very few invitations to renunciation. Countless triggers for greed, but few supports for contentment. Countless rewards for self-display, but almost none for egolessness. Countless pathways into resentment, indulgence, comparison, intoxication, and waste, but only a narrow path toward purification. This is why drifting is so perilous. Drift does not move toward liberation. Drift moves with conditioning, and conditioning left unexamined runs downhill. That is also why merely being not that bad is nowhere near safe enough. In worldly terms, one may seem harmless, respectable, even admirable. But from the perspective of Dhamma, the question is much sharper. Is greed fading or being fed? Is delusion weakening or being protected? Is the heart becoming disenchanted with becoming, or still secretly bargaining for a better version of it? Because as long as the roots remain, existence remains unstable. There is danger a pleasant rebirth can end. Health can turn. Relationships can collapse. Reputation can sour. Power can corrupt. Beauty can decay. Memory can fray. The mind can panic. The body can fail. Death can interrupt every unfinished negotiation. Then the force of habit continues. This is why the wise grow afraid of carelessness. Not neurotic fear, not theatrical fear, but a sober fear born of understanding. The kind of fear a person has when standing near a cliff in the dark. The kind of fear that does not paralyze, but sharpens attention. Because once we understand how little governs us, how vulnerable we are to mood, influence, appetite, and delusion, then continuing casually in samsara starts to look less like optimism and more like recklessness. We begin to see that this cycle is not a neutral landscape where a basically good person can comfortably wander until wisdom arrives someday. It is a burning field of causes and effects, and most beings wandering in it are half asleep. Even the moments that look harmless are not as safe as they seem. A conversation can seed resentment, a pleasure can deepen attachment, a success can inflate conceit, a disappointment can harden self-pity, an attraction can cloud judgment, an identity can become a prison, a role can become a mask. We think danger only means catastrophe, but in Dhamma danger often means accumulation, the quiet accumulation of tendencies, the repeated strengthening of what binds us, the almost invisible reinforcement of the habits that will shape action, speech, rebirth, and suffering. And because we live among others who are also accumulating like this, the social atmosphere itself becomes spiritually hazardous. We are influenced not only by our own kilesas but by the collective momentum of everyone else's. Entire cultures can normalize greed and call it success. They can normalize vanity and call it confidence. They can normalize addiction and call it leisure. They can normalize emotional dependency and call it romance. They can normalize noise and call it connection. They can normalize endless becoming and call it a meaningful life. If one does not have Dhamma, one gets carried by these definitions almost without noticing. Then what chance does a person have to do deep good consistently, unless there is serious practice? This is why the path cannot be treated as a hobby. The world does not gently support liberation. It tolerates it at best, and often resists it. To simplify desire goes against the economy of craving. To guard the senses goes against the entertainment culture of stimulation. To speak truthfully goes against the politics of image. To contemplate death goes against the mythology of endless postponement. To turn away from intoxication goes against social bonding built on heedlessness. To renounce egoic drama goes against personalities that survive by feeding on it. The current moves strongly in the other direction. So when the Buddha points to the rarity of wholesome conditions, he is inviting us to realism, not cynicism. Realism if the openings for harm are wide and frequent, and the openings for wisdom are narrow and easily missed. Then complacency is madness. To continue as though worldly life naturally ripens into freedom is to misunderstand the terrain completely. It is more likely to ripen into further entanglement, further exhaustion, further becoming, and further risk. This is why one who truly sees begins to feel urgency even before old age, illness, and death arrive in dramatic form. The danger was already here. It was always here, hidden inside our likes and dislikes, hidden inside the structure of ordinary life itself. And yet many do not feel this while life is still agreeable. That is another sign of delusion's power. When things are painful, people may remember the Dhamma. But when things are comfortable, attractive, prosperous, and emotionally rewarding, the heart often reveals its actual preference. It does not want liberation. It wants continuity with better decorations. It wants safer pleasure, nobler identity, more flattering circumstances, cleaner forms of attachment. It does not want the end of bondage. It wants bondage arranged more beautifully. And that is why the danger becomes even clearer when life is going well. Prosperity does not merely comfort us. It exposes us. It shows us, with painful honesty, how little interest the heart may truly have in release. And this is where a person has to become painfully honest. Forget philosophy for a moment. Forget lofty language. Just look at the ordinary conditions that make worldly life feel worth continuing. A little beauty, a little money, a little health, a little youth, a little status, a little influence, a little admiration from others, a little sweetness in the heart because someone wants you, needs you, misses you, praises, chooses you. These things do not seem dramatic when we list them one by one, but together they cast a spell. They make samsara feel livable. They make bondage feel negotiable. They make the burning house look charming in the evening light. When the body is still attractive, when the face still opens doors, when the voice still carries charm, when the mirror has not yet become an enemy, the mind quietly places confidence there. It may never say it out loud, but it believes, not yet. Life still has something for me. There is still time. There is still flavor left in this world. That belief is enough to postpone urgency. Not forever perhaps, but enough to keep the heart from turning fully toward release. The same is true of money, not even vast wealth, just enough comfort to soften fear, just enough access, enough convenience, enough control to make suffering feel manageable. When a person can buy privacy, buy distraction, buy travel, buy medicine, buy pleasure, buy attention, buy recovery time, the world seems less threatening. Not harmless, but less sharp. And because it feels less sharp, the heart does not ask the deepest question. It asks smaller questions. How can I maintain this? How can I increase it? How can I protect it? How can I enjoy it without losing it? Liberation feels too extreme to a mind still bargaining successfully with conditions. Health does something similar. When the body cooperates, when sleep comes, when digestion works, when walking is easy, when breathing is unnoticed, when pain is absent or mild, the illusion grows stronger. One begins to live as though embodiment were a stable arrangement. One does not feel the body as burden. One feels it as vehicle, ally, even ornament. And while that feeling lasts, the call to go beyond bodily identity sounds unnecessary, almost unfriendly. Why speak of the danger of existence when the body still seems to support pleasure, work, romance, recognition and movement through the world? And youth, of course, is one of the greatest intoxicants. Youth does not merely provide energy. It produces a strange kind of metaphysical laziness. It makes endings feel theoretical. It makes decay feel distant. It makes the future feel spacious enough for endless postponement. A young person can hear the truth of impermanence and still inwardly imagine an exception. Not in words perhaps, but in mood, in reflex, in the deep unspoken assumption that there is more time to seek, more time to fail, more time to wander, more time to indulge, more time to return to seriousness later. Later becomes the most dangerous word in spiritual life. Then there is social standing, reputation, usefulness, influence, the warm narcotic of being somebody, to be consulted, respected, followed, envied, celebrated, needed, to enter a room and feel one's presence register in the minds of others, to know one's name carries some weight. All of this nourishes identity, and identity, when fed well, does not seek extinction. It seeks refinement, it seeks moral polish, it seeks dignity, it seeks a cleaner self-image. But the ending of self-making, the relinquishment of the whole game of becoming, that is rarely attractive to a mind still being rewarded for playing it. And perhaps most binding of all is romantic fulfillment, or even the hope of it, the sweetness of being desired, the relief of being chosen, the thrill of mutual attention, the intoxication of secret messages, glance promises, plans. The sense that someone has looked at this unstable, aging, vulnerable life and said, "Yes, I want you." That feeling can keep people in bondage for years, with hardly any protest. Not because love is evil, but because longing joined with pleasure is one of the most convincing arguments for continued becoming. It tells the heart, stay. There is still tenderness here. There is still ecstasy here. There is still a reason to remain. So we have to ask quietly and truthfully, while these things are still blooming, how many really turn toward liberating truth? Not toward inspiration, not toward comfort, not toward ceremonial religion, not toward blessings for success, protection for family, emotional soothing, or meaning added to worldly life. How many turn toward a teaching that says, in essence, do not decorate the prison, understand it and leave? How many seek a path whose final honesty does not flatter beauty, does not worship youth, does not trust romance, does not sanctify ambition, does not promise that the world can be arranged into lasting satisfaction? Very few. This is not condemnation, it is diagnosis. It is simply difficult for a heart surrounded by sweetness to develop revulsion toward the cycle that provides that sweetness. As long as pleasure still arrives on schedule, as long as admiration still visits, as long as one still has options, leverage, desirability, and unfinished appetites, renunciation will feel severe. The world does not even have to be extraordinarily good. It only has to be intermittently pleasant. That is enough to keep hope alive. And hope, when attached to conditioned things, becomes one of the subtlest chains. This is why people can listen to profound teachings and still remain untouched. They may admire the words, quote the ideas, share the talks, even weep while hearing them. But when the talk ends, what do they return to with their full heart, their plans, their image, their attachments, their little kingdom of concerns? The Dhamma may be honored, but not obeyed, respected, but not entered, loved from a safe distance as one admires a mountain one has no intention of climbing. A person should test this in themselves. When life is favorable, what kind of spiritual interest arises? Is it the interest of one who wants release from the entire structure of craving and becoming? Or is it the interest of one who merely wants help managing pain while keeping favorite illusions intact? These are not the same. One seeks freedom, the other seeks improvement within captivity, and worldly sweetness is dangerous, precisely because it encourages that second kind of seeking. It whispers, you do not need to go so far, just be wiser. Be calmer, be kinder, be more balanced. Keep your pleasures, just hold them more gracefully. Keep your identity, just make it spiritual. Keep your ambitions, just purify your language. And for many people, this is enough. They do not want the root cut. They want the branches arranged. But someone who has begun to fear suffering deeply enough is different. That person may not be eloquent. They may not know scripture well. They may not look impressive. But something in them has already shifted. They are no longer asking how to make samsara prettier. They are asking how to stop being fooled by it. They no longer trust every pleasant mood as a blessing. They no longer assume opportunity is salvation. They begin to suspect that what feels sweet may also be a trap. That is why such a person listens differently. They do not come to Dhamma as entertainment. They do not come merely when it is convenient, when the schedule is free, when boredom appears, when heartbreak temporarily drives them inward. They come because they are hungry in a deeper way. They enter any room where truth is being spoken. They listen anywhere. They gather what they can. If one sentence helps weaken delusion, they treasure it. If one image helps expose attachment, they keep it close. If one teaching reveals the danger in what they used to call happiness, they do not run from it. They bow to it. This kind of listener does not measure Dhamma by immediate pleasure. They measure it by usefulness against bondage. They are willing to hear what bruises vanity, willing to hear what contradicts instinct, willing to hear what the world would call too dark, too sharp, too uncompromising. Why? Because they have already seen enough to know that compromise with delusion never ends well. A heart that truly fears the round of birth and death does not ask to be flattered. It asks to be shown the exit, and that is why hardship sometimes becomes a hidden blessing. Not because pain is holy in itself, but because pain can break confidence in the world. When beauty fades, when money fails, when health trembles, when youth leaves, when status turns fragile, when influence evaporates, when love wounds or disappears, the enchantment weakens. Then for the first time some people begin to hear, not because truth has changed, but because intoxication has thinned. What was always being said can finally enter. Still, the rare and noble case is not merely the person crushed by disappointment. Rarer is the one who can see through sweetness while sweetness is still present. The one who can say, yes, this is pleasant, but it is unstable. Yes, this is admired, but it decays. Yes, this feels intimate, but it cannot shelter me from aging, sickness, and death. Yes, this life still offers fragrance, color, and tenderness, but none of it cancels the burning. That person has begun to mature in wisdom. That person is not waiting for total ruin to become sincere, because sincerity in the path is revealed by what the heart does when the world is still smiling at it. If praise still comes, and yet one listens. If desire still burns, and yet one listens. If opportunity still opens, and yet one listens. If one is still loved, still wanted, still healthy, still rising in the eyes of others, and yet something deeper says, this cannot be my refuge, then there is real spiritual gravity there. There is the beginning of disenchantment. There is the beginning of true fear, not neurotic fear, but wise fear. The fear of continuing blindly in a process that offers moments of honey while concealing immeasurable ruin. Most people do not arrive there quickly. So long as they can still taste pleasure, they continue negotiating with impermanence. They continue hoping to extract a durable happiness from changing conditions. They continue imagining that one more achievement, one more relationship, one more season of beauty, one more restoration of health, one more financial victory, one more emotional fulfillment will finally make existence feel secure enough. But the structure never changes. Gain remains vulnerable to loss. Union remains vulnerable to separation. Youth remains vulnerable to age. Health remains vulnerable to pain. Identity remains vulnerable to collapse. Every sweetness comes signed with an ending. And when that fact begins to sink into the marrow, a different listener is born. Not one looking for relief alone, but one ready to understand why the Blessed One spoke so radically about release, so seriously about existence, and so relentlessly about the danger hidden inside what the world calls good fortune. From there, one can finally recognize who truly benefits from this teaching, and why that person approaches it unlike everyone else. That is the moment a real listener appears. Not the listener who comes because the temple is beautiful, or because the language sounds ancient and profound, or because spiritual culture feels elegant and soothing. Not the one who wants a few noble ideas to decorate a basically unchanged life. The real listener is the one who has begun to feel, deep down, that the whole arrangement of worldly existence is unstable, exhausting, and more dangerous than it first appears. If you find this useful, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment, because once that uneasiness becomes honest, the heart starts moving in a very different way. Such a person does not approach Dhamma as entertainment. They do not sit down to hear the teaching the way someone samples a new philosophy, compares traditions, or collects interesting insights. They enter every talk, every room, every chance to hear true instruction because suffering has stopped being theoretical. It is no longer an idea. It is no longer poetry. It is no longer a dramatic religious theme. It has become personal, undeniable, close. They have seen enough of loss, enough of confusion, enough of the mind's restlessness, enough of disappointment dressed up as success, enough of pleasure turning into worry, clinging, fatigue, and fear. So when there is a chance to hear something true, they do not stroll toward it, they move toward it. And they move with a kind of urgency that may look intense from the outside. But inside it is not hysteria, it is clarity. It is the sobriety of someone who finally understands that a house is on fire, and that admiring the curtains is no longer an intelligent use of time. It is not self-hatred. It is not bitterness toward life. It is not theatrical despair. It is mature urgency. It comes from having seen enough to stop playing games with impermanence. This is why some people enter every room where Dhamma is being taught. They listen here, then there, then wherever else the teaching is being explained. Not because they are greedy for spiritual novelty, but because anything genuine becomes precious when the disease has been recognized. If your heart is still drunk on the world, you will be selective. You will come only when convenient, only when the mood is right, only when nothing more attractive is available. But when disillusionment has ripened, you no longer ask, is this my preferred format? Is this speaker entertaining? Is the atmosphere ideal? You ask, is there something here that helps me understand suffering, its cause, its ending, and the path? If there is, you stay, you listen, you gather what you can. Even one sentence matters to such a person. Even one correction matters. Even one warning matters. Even one reminder about greed, hatred, delusion, mortality, heedlessness, restraint, mindfulness, relinquishment, or the fading of craving feels worth carrying home. That is why they seem eager. That is why they seem always ready to listen. Because they are no longer shopping for inspiration. They are searching for medicine. And to the worldly mind this can seem excessive. Why so serious? Why so eager? Why so willing to hear again and again about suffering, impermanence, danger, letting go? Why not enjoy life and take a little wisdom on the side? But that question only makes sense to someone who still believes enjoyment can be secured. It only makes sense to someone who still imagines that youth, health, beauty, money, affection, status, stimulation, and favorable conditions can be arranged in such a way that the heart will finally be safe. The sincere seeker has begun to see that these pleasant conditions are not only unstable, they are also morally dangerous. This is the part many people do not want to hear. Pleasant conditions intoxicate, they lower vigilance, they make the mind careless. When things go well, one easily forgets death. One easily excuses unwholesome intentions. One easily becomes proud, distracted, indulgent, possessive, competitive, jealous, and blind. A little beauty can feed vanity. A little money can feed greed. A little power can feed cruelty. A little praise can feed delusion. A little romantic sweetness can feed attachment so deep that wisdom cannot get a word in. So the one running toward the teaching is not always doing so, because life has visibly collapsed. Sometimes it is because they have become wise enough to fear what appears pleasant. They understand that comfort can be more dangerous than pain when comfort strengthens bondage. They understand that success can bury a person more deeply in becoming. They understand that favorable rebirth, refined pleasure, admiration, and worldly gains are not signs of ultimate safety. They are conditions in which forgetfulness easily thrives. That is why this path does not belong to those who still mainly want refined enjoyment. It does not belong to those whose idea of spirituality is better feelings, higher experiences, subtler pleasures, or celestial rewards. The Dhamma, in its deepest sense, leans away from intoxication. It leans toward dispassion. It cools, it empties out craving, it loosens the fist. It does not perfume samsara, so that one may dwell in it more elegantly. It reveals samsara so clearly that the heart begins to release its fascination with it. This is a path for those inclined to cooling rather than fever, relinquishment rather than acquisition, cessation rather than continuation, that can sound severe to a mind still enchanted by becoming. But to the one who is tired enough, wounded enough, honest enough, discerning enough, it sounds like mercy. Because what the world calls fullness often feels, to a wise person, like burden. What the world calls opportunity often feels like another opening for greed and grief. What the world calls living fully often means multiplying the causes of future loss. So the true listener comes humbly. That humility is important. Not everyone who attends many teachings is sincere. Some come to compare, to evaluate, to perform intelligence, to build identity, to become someone who knows. But the listener shaped by disenchantment comes with a softer posture. They know they are vulnerable. They know the mind can deceive itself. They know that left unchecked, it runs toward craving and away from truth. They know they are not above delusion, simply because they can speak about spirituality. So they listen with need. They listen with respect. They listen as a thirsty person pays attention to water. And usually, this kind of listener has already learned something painful, that worldly advantages do not automatically produce wisdom. A person may have health, youth, attraction, education, influence, money, a good reputation, romantic affection, and a future full of possibilities, and yet feel no urgency to understand the Dharma at all. Why would they? Everything around them is conspiring to say, stay asleep a little longer. The body is still cooperating. The world is still flattering. Desire is still receiving enough reward to remain hopeful. In such a season, very few seek liberation with sincerity. That is why it is often the disenchanted heart that runs fastest toward the teaching. Not because it is weak, but because it has become realistic. When someone has tasted enough of life to know that pleasant things do not stay pleasant, that every gain comes with vulnerability, that every attachment writes a future wound, that one's own mind is not reliably wholesome, then hearing the Dhamma no longer feels optional. It feels necessary. And there is another reason this listener comes again and again. It is because they have begun to see the imbalance within ordinary consciousness itself. If they are honest, they can admit that in a single day, unwholesome impulses often arise more easily than wholesome ones. Irritation comes quickly, envy comes quickly, restlessness comes quickly, pride comes quickly, lust comes quickly, fear comes quickly, self-protection, resentment, fantasy, judgment, and heedlessness come quickly. The good is possible, yes. Generosity is possible. Kindness is possible. Patience is possible. But one sees how unstable these are, how easily they are overrun. And when a person really notices this, the world stops looking innocent. If my own mind can tilt toward confusion so easily, what about all the other minds around me? If delusion is common in here, why assume wisdom is abundant out there? Then one begins to understand why life in the world is so morally hazardous. One sees how easily one can be shaped by the company of the careless, seduced by the values of the crowd, and swept into habits that darken the heart. Under those conditions, the chance to hear the Dhamma is not small. It is rare, it is protection, it is orientation, it is rescue from drift. So when that person hears there is a discourse, they go. When they find a room where truth is spoken plainly, they enter. When there is a teaching on mindfulness, they listen. On restraint, they listen. On death, they listen. On not self, they listen. On renunciation, they listen. On the danger in sensuality, they listen. Not because every talk will be perfect, and not because every speaker will express the Dhamma equally well, but because the heart has changed direction. It would rather be corrected than comforted. It would rather be awakened than entertained. This does not mean such a person becomes joyless. In fact, there is a quiet nobility in this urgency. There is tenderness in it. There is intelligence in it. It is the beginning of a cleaner love, a wiser hope. For the first time, the heart is not merely asking, how can I feel better within this cycle? It is asking, how can this cycle be understood so deeply that attachment to it weakens? That question marks a huge turning. It means the person is no longer merely trying to survive existence more pleasantly. They are beginning to seek freedom from the intoxication that keeps existence turning. And that is why the Buddha's path belongs to a very particular kind of person, not to the one still bargaining for finer forms of becoming, not to the one hoping for polished spiritual pleasure, not to the one wanting heavenly upgrades while remaining in love with the machinery of birth and death. It belongs to the one who has begun to fear samsara in an intelligent way, the one who sees that as long as greed can be fed, harm can be done. As long as delusion remains, one is not safe. As long as craving continues, renewed becoming remains near. Such a person does not hear the Dhamma casually. They hear it as someone who has finally understood the stakes. And yet, even this urgency, noble as it is not enough by itself. Because one may feel the fire and still delay. One may recognize danger and still turn away. One may hear the teaching and still choose distraction. So now we have to ask the harder question. What is truly at risk if this rare opportunity is neglected, postponed, or ignored? What is at risk is not some vague religious penalty. It is not a poetic warning meant to frighten weak minds. It is something much simpler, much more immediate, and much more sobering than that. The principle is plain. The more unwholesome the mind becomes, the more suffering follows. And when the opportunities to act out of greed, anger, vanity, jealousy, fear, and delusion are more frequent than the opportunities to act out of wisdom, restraint, kindness, and clarity, then decline is more likely than elevation. That is not pessimism, that is proportion. If a field is watered every day with poison and only once in a while with clean rain, what should grow there? If a path is walked 1,000 times in one direction and only once in another, which trail becomes deeper? The mind is like that. Habit is like that. Rebirth, in the Buddhist sense, is not an arbitrary reward system imposed from outside. It is the continuation of momentum. It is the ripening of tendencies. It is the unfolding of causes that have been fed again and again until they become stronger than our wishes, stronger than our self-image, stronger than the little stories we tell about who we think we are. This is why the Buddha's teaching can sound severe to those who still hope that life can be gently managed into permanent satisfaction. Because the teaching does not flatter our preferences. It does not say, as long as you mean well, things will work out. It does not say, a little greed is harmless, a little hatred is normal, a little delusion is no big problem. It looks directly at the structure of samsara and says, as long as the causes of bondage are being nourished, bondage continues. As long as the roots of suffering are not understood and abandoned, suffering remains near. And if we are honest, truly honest, we can begin to see why the danger is so great. In one ordinary day, how many moments are governed by generosity, and how many by grasping? How many are guided by patience, and how many by irritation? How many by contentment, and how many by comparison? How many by wisdom, and how many by mechanical reaction? Even among decent people, even among those who would never describe themselves as cruel, the mind is constantly bending towards self-protection, self-importance, self-pleasing, self-concern. It takes so little to stir resentment, so little to awaken envy, so little to make us lie, conceal, exaggerate, flatter, manipulate, or harden ourselves. This is not said to condemn the human being. It is said so that we stop romanticizing our condition. We like to think of ourselves as fundamentally good with occasional flaws. But from the standpoint of liberating wisdom, the picture is more unstable than that. We are mixtures. We are vulnerable. We are easily swayed. We are quick to rationalize. We are capable of wholesome intention, yes, but also deeply conditioned by impulses we do not fully see. And if these impulses continue unchecked, repeated and defended, then darker destinations are not dramatic fantasies. They are natural extensions of a deluded life. That is the part many people do not want to hear. Lower birth sounds archaic to modern ears. It sounds mythic, symbolic, maybe even embarrassing. But set aside the labels for a moment and look at the principle beneath them. When a mind becomes coarse, violent, addicted, blind, compulsive, predatory, or obsessively hungry, what kind of world is it preparing for itself? What kind of existence fits that momentum? A being does not fall because someone hates it. A being falls because the structure of its own mind has become heavy, dark, and downward pulling. The lower realms, however one first approaches them, are not theatrical inventions meant to scare children. They express a lawfulness. Degraded consciousness tends toward degraded experience. Even in this life, we can see shadows of those states. There are minds that live like burning hells, consumed by rage. There are minds that live like hungry ghosts, never satisfied no matter how much they consume. There are minds that live in animal confusion, driven by appetite and fear, with little room for reflection. There are minds so trapped in envy, panic, or brutality that human dignity has almost disappeared. If such tendencies harden and gather force, why should we assume the next to come must be noble, beautiful, educated, wealthy, healthy, admired, and spiritually fortunate? On what basis would we assume that? This is where sober reflection becomes necessary. We are so enchanted by the best-case scenario. We imagine returning again with a good face, a good family, a sound body, sharp intelligence, enough money, access to books, access to teachers, enough peace to practice, enough freedom to think clearly. We imagine being born where the Dhamma can still be heard, where the moral sense is not completely buried, where one can distinguish right from wrong and actually care about the distinction. But all of this is rare, painfully rare. To be born human is already difficult according to the tradition, but to be born human with favorable conditions is rarer still. To have health is rare. To have a functioning mind is rare. To meet teachings that point beyond mere success and survival is rare. To feel genuine urgency before old age, illness, loss and death crush the illusion of endless time is rare. And even among those who hear the Dhamma, how many truly hear it? How many listen without secretly negotiating? How many listen without trying to preserve their favorite attachments? How many listen with the courage to let the teaching accuse their delusions? Look carefully at the ordinary forces shaping life. Beauty seduces. Youth intoxicates. Strength gives confidence. Wealth creates distraction. Status enlarges pride. Romance captures the imagination. Social approval dulls spiritual hunger. None of these things are evil by themselves, but they easily become veils. A person with health, pleasure, admiration, opportunity, and emotional excitement usually does not run toward renunciation. Usually they do not ask how to leave the cycle. Usually they ask how to refine it, secure it, prolong it, decorate it, and protect it. They do not want release from becoming. They want becoming under better management. That is why suffering for many people becomes the doorway to seriousness. Not because misery is holy in itself, but because disappointment can strip away intoxication. When the heart becomes tired of being deceived, then it starts listening differently. When one has been burned enough times by gain and loss, praise and blame, love and separation, hope and collapse, then the Dhamma no longer sounds abstract. It sounds like medicine. It sounds like a map in a dangerous wilderness. It sounds like someone finally telling the truth without trying to entertain you. And the truth is unsettling. Chances for unwholesome action are abundant. Chances for wholesome action are comparatively fragile and often require effort, mindfulness and restraint. It is easy to be careless, easy to speak harshly, easy to indulge resentment, easy to pursue pleasure without reflection, easy to waste a human life in triviality, but to hold precepts carefully, to guard the senses, to cultivate generosity without vanity, to speak truthfully, to forgive, to reflect, to meditate, to investigate suffering deeply enough that dispassion begins to arise. These things do not usually happen by accident. They require intention. They require remembering what is at stake. They require swimming against the current. So when the current of life is running downhill, when the mind is mostly untrained, when the world offers endless stimulation for greed and aversion, then what is more probable? Ascent or descent? If the causes for bondage are more available than the causes for freedom, then bondage is the likelier result. If the doors to heedlessness are open all day, while the door to wisdom is opened only briefly and rarely entered, then we should not be surprised by where beings end up. The frightening part is not that this law is cruel. The frightening part is that it is so ordinary. And still, this reflection should not become hysteria. The point is not to make the listener despair. The point is to remove complacency. There is a difference. Despair says, there is nothing to be done. Dhamma says, see clearly while you still can. Complacency says, I will probably be fine. Wisdom says, do not gamble with causes you do not control. Fear rhetoric shouts and agitates. Dhamma reflection quiets the mind and makes it honest. It asks us to stop assuming safety where no real safety has been built. Because what have we really secured? A body that can fail overnight. A mood that changes with sleep, weather, hormones, memory and praise. A moral life easily shaken by temptation. A spiritual aspiration repeatedly postponed by convenience. We are more fragile than we admit. One harsh event can bring outrage. One desire can humiliate our principles. One long habit can outvote 100 good intentions. If that is true now, in a human life with some access to restraint and reflection, then how much more careful should we be about the future we are preparing? The thought of lower birth should not be held as superstition, but as moral realism. If consciousness is shaped by what it loves, fears, repeats, obeys, and clings to, then every day is training. Every reaction is rehearsal. Every indulgence strengthens some direction. Every moment of mindfulness interrupts something ancient. Every act of renunciation weakens the tyranny of craving just a little. Nothing is neutral for long. We are always leaning somewhere. And that is why returning again as a fortunate human being cannot be treated as a casual expectation. To come back with beauty, intelligence, education, resources, emotional balance, moral sensitivity, supportive conditions, and contact with liberating truth. This is not the default outcome of a drifting life. It is a rare convergence. It is a difficult blessing. It should inspire gratitude, urgency, and humility, not confidence. The wise person does not look at these favorable conditions and say, I have time. The wise person says, this is precarious, this could be lost. Let me use it well. When this is understood, the human condition appears exactly as it is. Precious, unstable, and dangerous. Precious because it allows practice. Unstable because it can vanish. Dangerous because without vigilance it tilts downward more easily than upward. And once this is seen, the Dhamma no longer appears as a decorative philosophy for peaceful moments. It appears as rescue. It appears as the only serious response to a situation most are too distracted to recognize. Now the danger has been named without exaggeration and without softness, not to terrify, but to wake up the heart. And once the heart truly sees how uncertain this entire movement of becoming is, then one final question remains. If the wheel is this perilous, what is the only response worthy of a compassionate and uncompromising path? If the wheel is this perilous, then the answer cannot remain vague. It cannot be postponed into a more convenient season. It cannot be turned into a comforting slogan. The answer has to be as serious as the danger itself. And this is where everything becomes very clear. The Dhamma that aims at liberation is not meant for a mind still bargaining for a better room inside samsara. It is not for the heart that says, let me keep the cycle, but let it be softer. Let me stay in becoming, but with more beauty, more success, more affection, more luck, more refinement. That mind may admire the teachings, may quote them, may even feel moved by them, but it has not yet turned in the direction the Buddha is pointing. Because the Buddha does not point toward improved captivity. He points out. That is the part many people do not want to hear. As long as the heart still hopes to decorate existence, stabilize existence, perfume existence, sweeten existence, or secure a more elegant version of existence, then the deepest layer of the teaching will feel too severe, too sharp, too unsentimental. Why? Because delusion does not want release. Delusion wants continuity with favorable conditions. It wants another chance, another form, another pleasure, another identity, another world in which craving can continue under more lighting. But the path of liberation does not flatter that instinct. It exposes it. This is why disenchantment is not a side note in the Dhamma. It is central, not bitterness, not hatred of life, not depression. Disenchantment means the spell begins to break, the glamour fades, the intoxication weakens. One starts seeing that what is called worldly happiness is never free from instability, dependence, fear, loss, and the constant pressure of maintenance. Even joy in this world comes tied to trembling. Even love trembles, even health trembles, even youth trembles, even reputation trembles, even power trembles, even heavenly hope trembles. Wherever becoming continues, vulnerability continues. And if vulnerability continues, then fear has reason. If clinging continues, then sorrow has an opening. If craving continues, then wandering continues. So the question becomes painfully simple. What is it that is actually wanted? Not what sounds noble, not what looks spiritual, not what can be said in public. Deep down, when no one is watching, when the performance falls away, what does the heart still seek? Is it blessing, relief, protection, better outcomes, more pleasant experiences, recognition from the spiritual world, a refined identity as a good practitioner, a future reward, a heavenly sweetness? Or is there at last a genuine weariness with the whole machinery of bondage? That honesty matters more than religious language. A person may come near the Dhamma for many reasons. Pain brings some, loss brings some, illness brings some, disappointment brings some, fear brings some, exhaustion brings some. For many people, this is how the door first appears. There is nothing shameful in that. In fact, suffering often does the merciful work of cracking open illusions that comfort could never challenge. But eventually, a further truth must be faced. Does one want the teachings merely to soothe the burns of samsara, or does one want to stop entering the fire? These are not the same. To seek comfort while remaining devoted to becoming is one thing. To seek release from becoming is another. One asks for better weather in the prison yard. The other asks how to leave the prison entirely. One still believes there must be something here worth securing at last. The other has seen enough instability, enough repetition, enough hunger, enough disappointment, enough hidden terror inside pleasure, enough grief inside attachment, enough danger in birth itself to say quietly, no more. I do not want a better chain. I want the end of chaining. That is the turning. And without that turning, the liberating Dhamma will always be misunderstood. It may be treated as a philosophy of emotional wellness, or as a system for moral self-improvement, or as a source of cultural beauty, or as a way to gain merit for future enjoyment, or as a mystical ornament for the ego. But all of that remains within the field of becoming. All of that still moves inside the old hunger. All of that still assumes that the project is to continue. But more skillfully, more nobly, more pleasantly, the Buddha's vision is more radical than that, and more compassionate than that. He looks directly at the cycle and says, this does not become safe merely because it becomes subtle. It does not become worthy merely because it becomes refined. Gross forms of suffering are easy to fear, But subtle existence can deceive precisely because it appears polished, elevated, peaceful, or luminous. Yet whatever still arises, changes and passes cannot be ultimate refuge. Whatever is conditioned cannot guarantee safety. Whatever can be lost cannot be the final answer. This is why even the most delicate mode of existence is not beyond scrutiny. As long as there is presence within the conditioned, there remains limitation. As long as there is becoming, there remains the seed of ending, and therefore the seed of distress. This is hard for the ordinary mind to accept, because the ordinary mind is drunk on contrast. It says, surely a finer existence must be enough. Surely a purer pleasure must be enough. Surely a more exalted form of life must be enough. But the teachings keeps answering with tremendous sobriety, enough for what? Enough to distract, perhaps. Enough to delight, temporarily. Enough to delay panic, maybe. Enough to free, no. And this is where the old image becomes unforgettable. The problem is not only in the obviously ugly forms of life. The problem is in the very fact of conditioned existence itself. Large or small, coarse or subtle, lowly or exalted, if it belongs to the field of birth and death, it cannot satisfy the heart that longs for the unshakable. The Buddha's compassion is so complete that he refuses to lie about this. He does not tell beings to adore the wheel. He teaches them to understand it, become disenchanted with it, and leave it. But to hear that clearly, the heart must already be ripening. It must begin to feel that worldly promises, however glittering, cannot answer the deepest wound. As long as one still dreams passionately of becoming someone, possessing something, extending something, preserving something, triumphing somewhere, being admired, being loved, being reborn into splendor, the path of renunciation will seem excessive. It will seem like a theft. It will feel as if the Dhamma is asking too much. Yet from another angle it asks only this: stop clinging to what cannot keep its promise. That is not cruelty, that is mercy. And maybe this is the most intimate place to pause and examine. If beauty comes, what happens to the mind? If health comes, what happens? If youth is still present, if desire is still strong, if praise increases, if affection is available, if status grows, if influence expands, if one is still wanted by the world, does the heart naturally incline toward release? Usually not. Usually it leans outward, it becomes busy, it becomes enchanted again. It tells itself there is still time. It says practice can wait. It says wisdom can be pursued later. It says first let me enjoy, build, secure, taste, become. And yet, later is never guaranteed, and enjoyment never ends craving, and becoming never cures the fever to become. This is why those who begin to feel disillusioned are not unfortunate in the deepest sense. Painful, yes. Lonely, often yes, but not unfortunate. To start seeing the instability of all this is to feel less drunk on the world is the beginning of spiritual adulthood. To discover that even one's favorite hopes still carry the structure of bondage is not failure. It is awakening from seduction. There is grief in that awakening. There is no need to pretend otherwise. Something is being lost, and what is being lost is precious to the deluded mind. Fantasy is being lost. Romance with becoming is being lost. The trust that the next arrangement will finally save us is being lost. The confidence that we can negotiate a permanent home inside impermanence is being lost. That hurts. Of course it hurts. But it is the pain of opening the eyes, not the pain of being punished. And if one can bear that pain without running back into intoxication, then practice becomes real. Then renunciation is no longer a dramatic gesture. It becomes intelligence. Restraint becomes kindness to oneself. Mindfulness becomes protection. Clear seeing becomes nourishment. Simplicity becomes relief. Solitude becomes medicine. The teachings stop sounding abstract and start sounding exact. One no longer asks the Dhamma to bless attachment. One asks it to reveal attachment. One no longer asks for a more fortunate dream. One asks to wake up, That is why this path belongs to those who are ready to be honest, not perfect, not pure in some idealized way, but honest. Honest enough to admit, I am still attached. Honest enough to admit, part of me still wants the world. Honest enough to admit, I still shop in samsara. And then deeper still, honest enough to ask whether that shopping has ever truly satisfied, whether all the browsing through identities and pleasures and hopes has ever delivered anything but temporary intoxication, followed by fear, fatigue, or loss. If that question is allowed to mature, something noble begins, not loud. A quiet revulsion toward bondage, a quiet respect for truth, a quiet gratitude for a path that does not seduce but liberates. One begins to understand why the Buddha spoke so firmly. Not because he lacked tenderness, but because tenderness without truth would have abandoned us to the wheel. His severity is compassion with no interest in pleasing delusion. So, in the end, the measure is urgent and simple. Does the heart still want to remain here, only under better conditions? Or is it finally ready to walk in the direction of release? Does it still seek sweetness within the cycle, or has it begun to fear the cycle itself? Does it still dream of becoming, or has it started to value the peace that lies beyond becoming? Each person must answer alone, and perhaps that answer should not be rushed. It should be felt in silence, felt in the body, felt in the old habits, felt in the moments of wanting, fearing, desiring, remembering, planning. There, the truth appears. There, one sees whether the world is still being negotiated with, or whether the heart has begun, however tremblingly, to let. If it has begun, then protect that beginning, respect it, feed it with practice, with restraint, with wise companionship, with contemplation, with repeated remembrance of danger and impermanence. Do not be ashamed of disenchantment. Do not mistake sobriety for coldness. Do not confuse renunciation with loss alone. There is loss, yes, but there is also the first taste of not being deceived, and that is already a kind of freedom. So let the final movement be simple and grave. Look directly at existence. Do not decorate it to avoid seeing it. Do not sentimentalize bondage. Do not ask the path of liberation to become a servant of craving. Let the intoxication with becoming fade. Let the heart grow tired of promises that always expire. Let wisdom become more valuable than consolation, truth more valuable than fantasy, release more valuable than every shining offer made by the world. End in a grave but tender tone, not with despair, but with a clear invitation to look directly at existence. Lose the intoxication with becoming, and value liberation above every worldly promise.